Hi, I'm Helen. Now, let me take you on a journey that changed everything I knew about trust and betrayal. At 26, I was balancing a career as a dedicated nurse and managing my personal life, which was already hard. I worked long shifts at a busy hospital, often skipping breaks to make sure my patients got the best care. Even though I was tired, I found joy in my work, knowing I made a difference each day. But outside the hospital, another challenge was waiting for me, a financial burden brought on not by bad luck, but by my own family. My parents always acted like victims of bad situations, whether it was because of failed investments or unexpected medical bills. They always seemed to be struggling with money, and their stories were convincing. My heart went out to them every time. "We just need a little help to get back on our feet," they'd say, and I believed them, thinking their need for help was only temporary. Out of love and loyalty, I made a choice I would later deeply regret. I gave them my credit card, trusting their promise that it was just for a little while. That card was supposed to be a temporary solution, but as weeks turned into months and months into years, it became their endless source of money. At first, I didn't notice the lies. I was too busy with work and too tired to look closely. When I saw new gadgets at their house or heard them mention dining at fancy restaurants, I didn't think much of it. They always had an excuse. "Oh, these are just small treats for ourselves. We've been feeling down," they'd say. I'd nod, too exhausted to question it. But slowly, the truth started to bother me. Things like a brand new TV or a designer watch on my dad's wrist began to catch my attention. They called it a small splurge and brushed off my confused looks. Then, one evening, everything became clear. I came home to find a delivery at my door, a luxury handbag ordered online with my credit card. That's when my suspicion turned into a harsh realization. I knew I had to confront them. As I drove to their house, the weight of betrayal pressed heavily on my heart. I walked in, holding up the handbag, my hands and voice shaking. "Mom, Dad, where did this come from?" "Oh, Helen, do you like it? We thought it might cheer you up. You've been working so hard," Mom said, her voice overly cheerful. "With my credit card? This has to stop. We need to talk about all these expenses," I replied, my heart heavy as I prepared for the difficult conversation ahead. They sat down, their faces shifting from surprise to defensiveness. I spread out months of credit card statements across the table, each one proving their betrayal. The room grew quiet as the truth of their actions became clear. This was the turning point, a moment when I had to take back control of my life and finances. Later, sitting at the bank, I stared at the loan officer in disbelief. "Declined? But my credit should be excellent." "I'm sorry, Helen, but your debt-to-income ratio is very high, and there are recent charges that are, well, quite extravagant," she explained. I grabbed the printout, scanning the charges. Hawaii, designer boutiques, none of it was mine. It hit me, my parents hadn't just taken advantage of me, they'd gone way too far. "I need to see every transaction from the last 6 months, I demanded, panic and anger rising in my voice. Armed with the records, I drove straight to my parents' house. The documents felt heavy, like the weight of their betrayal. I slammed the papers down on the kitchen table. "Mom, Dad, we need to talk, now," I said, my voice firm. "Helen, what's going on? You're scaring us," Mom said, glancing at the papers. "Scaring you? Look at these charges: Hawaii, luxury boutiques. When were you going to tell me about this?" I asked, my anger barely controlled. "Oh, Helen, we were going to tell you. We just needed a little break. You know, a bit of happiness," Dad said, his voice weak and pleading. "Happiness? At my expense? Without even asking me? Do you realize you've nearly bankrupted me? I can't even get a loan because of what you've done," I shouted, the frustration boiling over. "We thought you wouldn't mind. You've always helped us before," Mom whispered, avoiding my eyes. I mind a lot. This isn't helping, it's stealing. You've been living a life of luxury on my hard work. How could you do this to your own daughter?" I asked, my voice breaking. Their silence was all the answer I needed. Their eyes stayed down, unable to meet mine. "We're sorry, Helen, it just got out of hand," Mom finally said, her voice full of regret. "We don't want to lose you over this," Mom pleaded. "Sorry doesn't fix my credit score or rebuild my trust," I said firmly. "I'm taking my card back, and I'm taking steps to protect myself. This stops now. No more access to my finances." "But Helen, we need your help. Without you, we—" "No," I interrupted. "You need to figure out how to manage without relying on me. I'm not your bank. If you had been honest, Maybe we could have worked something out, but not anymore. I need to protect myself. As I left their house, the air felt heavy, charged with the weight of our broken relationship. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing. This wasn't just about money, it was about respect and independence. I had been their safety net, their endless source of funds, but that was over. As I turned the key in my front door, I stepped into a new chapter of my life, one where I was no longer a victim of their choices, but in control of my own future. The day of their trip came, and I felt a mix of dread and determination. Watching Mom and Dad pack, chattering excitedly about beaches and luau's, made my heart ache. They were so lost in their fantasy, funded by my hard work, that they didn't notice the storm of emotions inside me. "Hey, I got you a new credit card. The old one's been acting up, keeps getting declined at the scanner. I don't want you to have any issues on your trip," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my emotions were all over the place. "Oh, Helen, you always take such good care of us. Thank you, sweetheart," Mom replied, her voice full of gratitude, which only stung me more with its irony. She swapped the cards without even a second glance. Watching them pack, I added, "Make sure you keep it safe and don't lose it, okay?" "Of course, darling, we'll be careful," Dad said, giving me a quick hug. I hugged him back, my stomach churning with the weight of what I had done. The card they now held was a dummy. They had no idea that their access to my finances was finally cut off. I watched them drive off to the airport. As soon as their car disappeared around the corner, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, only to be replaced by another, the heavy anticipation of what was to come. I headed back inside, my steps feeling heavier with each moment. Over the next few days, my routine centered around checking my online banking app constantly, my anxiety growing by the hour. Then it happened. The first notification popped up, a charge attempt at a luxury resort for a lavish dinner, declined. I exhaled a breath I hadn't even realized I was holding. Later that evening, while I tried to distract myself with a book in my quiet living room, another alert came through. This time, it was for a spa treatment, declined again. I could almost picture the scene, Mom and Dad, relaxed and unaware, suddenly confused as the spa attendant politely handed back the card, a frown on her face. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be a problem with your card. It's been declined." "That can't be right. Run it again, please," Dad would insist, his voice confident but tinged with embarrassment. After the third attempt and yet another apology from the attendant, their confusion would turn to frustration. I imagined them stepping aside, calling the credit card company as their perfect holiday began to unravel. The phone rang late into the night, but I let it go to voicemail. Mom's voice came through, filled with panic. "Helen, darling, there's something wrong with the card. We can't pay for our treatments, and they're quite upset. Can you check on it for us?" I waited, gathering my thoughts before calling back. "Mom, I'm looking into it. I'll see what I can do," I lied, feeling a pang of guilt but reminding myself that this was necessary. They needed to understand the consequences of their actions. The next day brought more declined transactions, a shopping spree, a helicopter tour, a gourmet lunch. Each notification was a step closer to their realization and my freedom. This tough love was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was crucial for my own survival. They had to learn, and reality was the only teacher that could get through to them. Early the next morning, the phone rang again, piercing the silence. I braced myself as I answered. Dad's voice, usually so confident, trembled with desperation. "Helen, please, we need your help. We can't pay for the hotel, and they won't let us check out until we settle the bill." Taking a deep breath, I steadied my voice, making sure each word carried the weight of my decision. "Dad, no, I won't bail you out this time. Do you even realize what you've done? Years of lying and using me, enough is enough." "But we're your parents, Helen, you can't just leave us stranded." We apologized. "Okay, we're sorry." Sorry doesn't change the past, Dad. It doesn't erase the debt you've piled up in my name, and it doesn't rebuild the trust you shattered. You need to understand the consequences of your actions, I said, my voice firm yet steady. They had crossed too many lines, and now, it was time for them to face the reality of what they had done. "Helen, we really didn't think it would come to this. We thought we could manage it, that you wouldn't have to know," Mom said, her voice a mix of pleading and regret. "Not have to know? You committed fraud in my name," I replied, the weight of their betrayal echoing in the stillness of my kitchen. "I've already taken steps to prevent any further damage. The card you have is cancelled. You need to figure out how to get back on your own. But we have nothing here, no money, Not even for a flight back. Please, just this once more, Dad begged, desperation in his voice. No, Dad, this is the hard lesson you need to learn. From now on, you handle your finances, and I handle mine. No more mixing, no more helping out. It's time for both of you to take responsibility. As their protests grew more frantic, a pang of sorrow hit me, for the parents I thought I had, but that feeling was quickly overshadowed by a stronger sense of duty to myself. I need to go now. I hope you find a way back, and I truly hope you learn from this. Goodbye, Mom and Dad. Hanging up the phone, the finality of the moment settled over me like a heavy blanket. The bridge had been burned, the ties cut. It was a decision shaped by years of hidden exploitation, now painfully exposed. I sat down, a swirl of emotions taking hold, grief for what was lost, but also a new sense of freedom from the financial chains I'd unknowingly worn for so long. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if it, too, was breathing a sigh of relief. This was my new reality, no longer a victim, but a survivor, no longer a daughter manipulated by guilt, but an independent woman stepping into a future I would control. I stood in my modest apartment, watching the sun dip below the city skyline, the weight of my decisions wrapped around me like a cloak. It was done. The calls to my credit companies, the fraud alerts, consultations with a financial advisor, every step carefully planned to secure my future. In the quiet of my living room, I dialed legal services, ready to hold my parents accountable, not out of spite, but necessity, to prevent future betrayals. Yes, I'd like to discuss options for financial fraud committed by family members, I said to the person on the other end. Their reassurances were a balm to my frayed nerves. With each action, I felt the chains of my old life, one defined by their needs and deceit, fall away. I was forging a new path, one that was finally mine. Filling out the paperwork for the fraud report, my hands were steady. I detailed the years of financial abuse, and as I submitted it, it felt like closing a door that had let in nothing but storms. This is to protect my future, I reminded myself, the mantra easing the sting of reporting my own parents. The days that followed were a blur, meetings with my bank to restructure my accounts, setting up new, secure financial protections, and therapy sessions to work through the guilt and betrayal that had knotted up my thoughts. One evening, after a particularly long day, I walked into my apartment and felt, for the first time in years, a sense of peace. I found a letter slipped under my door. It was from Mom and Dad. My hands trembled as I opened it, half expecting pleas for forgiveness or more manipulative excuses, but instead, it was an apology, real, or at least as real as it could be given the circumstances. We understand now the pain we've caused, they wrote. While we can't undo the past, we hope you can find it in your heart to forgive us someday. We're getting the help we need to manage our finances and our lives. I let the letter fall onto the counter, a sense of finality washing over me. Forgiveness seemed like a distant and winding road, not something I was ready to travel just yet. Right now, it wasn't about them, it was about me. It was about healing and building the life I deserved. That night, as I sat watching another sunset, a cup of tea warming my hands, I felt a profound peace settle within me. The ties that had once bound me were not just loosened, they were severed, leaving me free to create a future on my own terms. A future not dictated by guilt or manipulation, but one driven by my own choices, integrity, and the hard lessons I had learned along the way. Freed from both financial and emotional turmoil, I was no longer just Helen the daughter, the nurse, or the enabler. I was Helen the survivor, the architect of her own destiny. As the sun disappeared, leaving the sky streaked with colors of hope, I knew I was exactly where I needed to be, free. Now that Helen has taken bold steps to free herself from financial and emotional manipulation, how would you handle a similar situation with someone close to you? Would you be able to make the tough decisions necessary to protect yourself? Let's discuss in the comments below. Share your thoughts and experiences. If you found Helen's journey inspiring or thought-provoking, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Your support helps us bring these important narratives to light. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to reading your comments.
The incessant singing of birds from early morning has become very annoying. The man wanted to get up and chase them all away, or turn up the music louder, just so he wouldn't hear their singing. John was angry because for once he had decided to sleep in for an extra hour, but the birds woke him up and stirred up an uncontrollable rage. He hated birds because they were associated with his best days. He also hated himself for not finding the strength to do the right thing back then. Though, who could say what was the right thing to do? Then it seemed right, but now he thought differently. He was younger then and didn't understand much. Now he knew for sure that it was very difficult to correct past mistakes. Forced to get up, the man took a shower out of habit, prepared himself a cup of espresso, and while the coffee was cooling down, he managed to change clothes. John did everything out of habit. All his actions were so repetitive that life resembled a series of grey weekdays that repeated themselves over and over again. It was more like Groundhog Day, as if he was stuck in a time loop, and all the events in his life were painfully familiar. The man knew exactly how his day would go, but today was going to break his usual routine and knock John out of his rut. As usual, John left his car in the parking lot, straightened his jacket, and slowly walked towards the office building. Suddenly, a dirty boy flew out to meet him. Beggars never came so close to this place before, because the business centre was under guard. John began to look around because a 10-year-old child should not ask for alms alone. But who can understand these cunning schemes according to which beggars act? Every time they come up with a new way to get more money from people. The man already wanted to bypass the boy, but he did not allow himself to do so, almost throwing himself at John's feet. And then John decided that if he gave the child a little, he would certainly leave him alone. He put his hands in his pockets, but there was no change or cash at all, because the man was used to paying for everything with cards, and only withdrew money in the most extreme cases. "I don't have any money. Go find another victim." John frowned, trying to push the boy away. But the boy didn't intend to give up. He looked at John with a pleading gaze and didn't dare say anything. The man began to lose patience. On the one hand, he wanted to help the child, as it was clear that he was hungry and hadn't eaten properly for a long time, judging by the shabby clothes hanging on him like on a skeleton. John spent a decent amount of money every month to help the needy, and he was never told where it was spent. And how can you trust this child? What if you give him money for food, and he will give it to someone else who exploits him? "You're my dad! Help!" the boy whispered, confused. For a moment the man was stunned, lost for words, and didn't know what to do. But after thinking over the child's words again in his head, John laughed. "Dad? You probably mistook me for someone else, kid." To be honest, John had already gotten used to the fact that they were trying to impose other people's children on him. Everyone wanted to profit from someone else's, and John treated such statements with irony. Probably the child was taught how to press on the pity of the rich people, and not only pity. The kid threatened to the name of John Reynolds because journalists could hide anywhere to get a fresh gossip or a scandal. And right now, they were probably nearby, keeping their cameras ready. How much John hated the press. Okay, if they wrote news by fact, but no, they usually twisted everything and passed the lies off as truth so skillfully that people began to believe them. "So, kid, you seem to be crossing all boundaries." John grabbed the boy by the hand and dragged him to the side. The man was scary to break something in him because the boy looked weak. However, the boy turned out to be tough, and when John took his hand, he made good resistance. Curious looks were followed on John and the boy, and it made John uncomfortable. He feared that at any moment the boy's mother would jump out of the bushes and start screaming that her child was being mistreated. He would have to pay a lot of money to silence them. John's head began to ache, his blood pressure rising from nervousness. Glaring at the boy, John retorted, Who do you think I am, your father? I don't have any children, and never have. Of course, considering the wild life John had led at one time, he could have had a child, but it was unlikely that this boy was his illegitimate son. "Mom said," stammered the boy, digging his bony hands into his pockets, "that you're my dad." "Did your mum tell you anything else? Like the fact that there are aliens living in space, for example?" Look! The boy pulled a ring with jade out of his pocket and handed it to the shocked John. He would recognize this piece of jewelry even with his eyes closed, as he made it himself and gave it to his beloved girlfriend once. He learned to create jewelry from his grandfather when he was young. But when John moved to his father, he went wild, felt the taste of money, and lost his mind. He gave this ring to Lizzie before their separation, which was supposed to be short, but ended up lasting a lifetime. "Come with me," John said through clenched teeth, swallowing the lump in his throat and holding the ring the boy gave him. Of course, the man could have pretended that he didn't notice anything unusual, but it was just an ordinary piece of jewelry, of which there are so many sold in underground passages. But he recognized it. And if this really was his son, his heart beat unevenly against his ribs. A heart arrhythmia is a bad sign at your age, John would have been told by a doctor, but John thought to himself that it would probably be better to have that very same arrhythmia at this second than such a release of adrenaline in the blood. He looked at the boy walking beside him and couldn't understand how one could receive a hello from the past after so many years. He parted ways with Lizzie almost 11 years ago. Of course he often thought of her, but he would never have dared to return to her life again after succumbing to his father's influence, his desire for money, and betraying his love. The man hated the singing of the birds because it reminded him of her, of beautiful Lizzie, a beautiful girl with a light soul and a big, kind heart. They often spent time in nature by the lake, on the patio of the house, walking through the forest and listening to the singing of birds. And when Lizzie was no longer in John's life, he hated the chirping that cut deep into his soul, where all feelings and memories were buried. On the way to his office, everyone kept staring at John and the boy with their mouths open, as if they had seen a miracle, and the man was angry and ready to cover everyone's eyes with tape. He didn't fully understand why he had gotten involved with the boy, but there was something about this situation that made him act this way, not otherwise. "Are you sure you're my son?" John asked, squinting slightly, when he and the boy were in his office. "That's right, Mom showed me your pictures. She said that only you can help me." "And what about your mum? Let's say it's true and you're my son. You're already a grown-up boy. Tell me, why did your mum keep silent all these years and not tell me anything?" "She was probably scared, didn't want to interfere in your life. But now a bad thing has happened. Mum was sent to prison. I need help. I'm not asking you for money. Help me get my mum out. She said I could ask you for shelter, so I wouldn't be taken into a children's home, but I don't need it. If I helped save my mum, I would go to the orphanage and go to jail for my mum. I actually want to save her." John slumped into his chair, his hair standing on end from what he had just heard. Lizzie had been imprisoned. The always exemplary girl could never end up in prison. Had she changed so much in these years? It seemed like the boy standing in front of him was a quite grown-up, although he may have spoken intelligently, but he was still a kid whose eyes was filled with the strongest fear. "What's your name, kid?" John asked. "Ryan. Mum said that my dad wanted to name me. She never told me anything about you before. never said where you disappeared to, and when the police came she had no other choice. She handed me the ring and told me to try to find help from you, since we have no one else, and I didn't want to go to an orphanage. It's not good there, and no one will help my mum then. Ah, what's your mum's name? John was still trying to convince himself that this was not his son, despite the multitude of pieces of the same puzzle that were ready to fit into a common picture. Lizzie, you know what her name is, the boy frowned. Mum kept clippings from newspapers with your interviews. I didn't understand why she was collecting them all, but then it dawned on me. I don't know why she was afraid to tell me about you. I wouldn't have come without a reason, like now. And why did they imprison your mum? John continued to bombard the boy with questions, even though he knew he had to think about how he could help. Our neighbour, Mrs. Garrison, was very sick. She helped us at one time like no one else. She sat with me while my mum was at work. She was like a grandmother to me. My mum worked in a hospital and had access to medicines that were very difficult to get. Mrs. Garrison had to wait until all the approvals were passed. But how much to wait if the poor old lady was dying of pain while she went through all the necessary commissions? Anyway, my mother decided to take some and then return it when Mrs. Garrison got her medicine. But they noticed it, and she was condemned, saying she should have waited, and they would have given it to her for free. One good thing, Mrs. Garrison was taken to the hospital. They took her under special care now. I don't know how to get my mother out. If I had the money to bribe whoever I had to. Oh, kid, John said, shaking his head. You're still too young to be giving bribes to anyone. But I'm a real man, Ryan protested. You should not look at me for being a boy. I would do anything for my mother. Suddenly, it seemed to the man that he was not talking to a child currently, but to a fully formed adult personality. The boy spoke just like an adult. Although, according to John's rough calculations, he was only 10 years old. Okay, let's think of something together to get your mum out of prison. They shouldn't have put her there for that. And if we have to, we'll give a bribe. I don't have any money, Ryan said, shaking. And the ring, his mum strictly forbade him from selling it just like that. She said that only if someone threatened my life, then you would refuse to help. But otherwise, she asked to keep the precious thing safe. John's heart tightened, and that nasty suffocating lump formed in his throat again. It was hard for the man to think about the past, when he was so happy, but left it all behind. How would his life have turned out now if he had chosen the woman he loved instead of the money back then? He probably would have worked somewhere in a company or maybe become a farmer. Who knows? Now you can't even guess how it could have been if. And Lizzie didn't forget about him. She kept his ring. So she loved him, not hated him. Or maybe it was the other way round. Perhaps she wanted to use it as a weapon against him one day and blame him for everything, saying everything she had kept inside for years. Summoning his secretary, John ordered her to get clothes and a meal for the boy as quickly as possible while he was in a meeting. He also strongly recommended that Ryan did not leave the office and warned the secretary that if he disappeared, the punishment would be severe. During the meeting, John couldn't stop thinking about Lizzie. She was always too kind and self-sacrificing, always doing so much more for others than she did for her. She was a real angel, and remained so. Deciding that he would pull Lizzie out at any cost, John was afraid to think about what would happen to them afterward. He didn't expect her to welcome him with open arms. He wanted to ask Ryan if his mother had raised him alone all these years, and if she had a husband during that time. However, he felt that it would be shameful to ask a child such questions. even though Ryan tried to act grown-up and independent. After the meeting, John returned to the office to find that Ryan had already been fed. However, there was no smile on his face, only sadness because he missed his mother. They were each other's only family. Even though his mother always considered him a child, Ryan tried to help her, and in the small country community where they were living, he always found a part-time job. Sometimes he bought her flowers or bought her chocolate to see her smile. Of course, she scolded him for being too young to earn money, but also praised him for his independence, since she had no family to rely on. Most of all, she feared that he would be taken away and sent to an orphanage. So she tried to earn as much money as possible to pay off the debts she had gotten while Ryan was a baby and often sick. Lizzie did everything for her son, and Mrs. Garrison was the only person who helped. Ryan understood how difficult it was for his mother to take that step. She agonized over it for a long time, tormented by doubts. And he also knew that she had been set up. He saw in his mother's shocked face how surprised she was when the police told her how many ampules of medicine she had taken. "I only took one to help the elderly person. Why do I need so many?" Mrs. Garrison would have been given it in a few days anyway, but she just couldn't suffer any more pain, Lizzie cried. "Who knows? Maybe you're selling them. In any case, you'll be imprisoned for a very long time for this." Ryan hid, trembling and afraid that he would be noticed. Before opening the door to the police, his mother gave him instructions on what to do if she was taken away. Now the boy was deeply upset, afraid to even think about what would happen to his mother. Of course, she was afraid to take that step because of her son. She was afraid that he would be taken to an orphanage, but she couldn't leave the elderly woman to die in agony. She wanted to help her a little, to ease her suffering. John called a good acquaintance and asked him to gather information on where Lizzie was taken and how bad things were. While he tried to distract himself with work, he entirely ignored the presence of his own son in the office. And why would he be sure he was really his child? What if Lizzie gave birth to another man's child? But now, looking at the boy, John noticed a certain resemblance to himself in childhood. It was like looking at old photos on an album. Soon the acquaintance called back and named a sum of money that would make the case go away. He managed to find out that the head of the clinic where Lizzie worked had long had a grudge against the woman and took advantage of her small mistake to get rid of this too righteous employee who always tried to achieve justice. Without hesitation, John transferred the necessary amount and began to get ready to go after Lizzie. By that time, clothes had been brought for Ryan, and the man ordered him to change. He paid no attention to the sideways glances of his subordinates. He decided that he would now take Lizzie from the detention center, take her and Ryan home, and that would be the end of the story with his newly found son. However, seeing the girl from his past, his head started spinning. The events that brought many pleasant and memorable moments came flooding into his mind, and it was difficult to cope with them. Lizzie hesitantly looked at John and said that she would definitely thank him. But the man did not need gratitude. The only thing he desperately wanted was to talk to Lizzie, and he begged her for it. Just one conversation. After bringing them home with the boy, John decided that Lizzie and her child would definitely not live in this place. He wanted to take everything on himself and buy them a new home. The only thing left was to convince Lizzie to accept such an immodest gift without thinking that he was trying to redeem his sins. John was confident that he could do it, even if not right away. Lizzie told John that the head of the clinic had been after her for a long time, trying to seduce her, despite having a wife and children. Of course, Lizzie refused, and the man promised to cruelly avenge her and hit her when she least expected it. I didn't steal any medicine. I got permission from him to take 1 ampule. But it turned out to be a trap. I don't know what I would have done if not for you. You saved me and Ryan. Why didn't you tell me earlier that I had a child? John asked with hurt in his voice, even though he scolded himself. After all, it didn't make sense for John to be angry at Lizzie. He was to blame for many things, including her not telling him the truth about their son. Lizzie was silent for a while, as if trying to gather her thoughts and choose the right words. Then she looked at John sadly. I tried. I found your address and came to tell you about the pregnancy, but your father kicked me out. He said you were getting married, and then the news of the wedding broke. What was I supposed to do? You didn't want to talk, you didn't tell me anything. You didn't even say that you were planning to marry someone else. It was a marriage of convenience. We divorced a few months after the merger of the companies. John tried to justify himself. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I really wish you could find it in your heart to give it to me. My father didn't tell me about the child. I didn't know. But that doesn't diminish my guilt. John got up, said goodbye to Lizzie and left, realizing that they both needed time. He had to come to terms with the fact that he had a son, and Lizzie had to think things over and decide whether she was ready to trust someone who had betrayed her once again. John knew that he would do everything now to make this woman happy, but he doubted that she would believe him again. John knew that he would do everything now to make this woman happy, but he doubted that she would believe him again. The man started visiting his former girlfriend and son frequently, bringing gifts. One day, the boy invited him to have a serious conversation. Stop tormenting Mum. Thank you for your help, but you need to make up your mind. Either apologize to her properly and live together, or stop coming here for no reason. Mum cries secretly after your visits. She's still suffering. I can't bear to see her suffer. That's not why I came to you for help. John was proud of his son, who was smart and brave beyond his years, and he finally decided to talk to Lizzie. The woman found the strength to forgive the man and let go of all the resentment, stepping from the past into the present, across the huge chasm that had once separated them. Lizzie and her son moved into John's house. Ryan was transferred to a private school where he could develop all his abilities. Newspapers continued to write articles about the millionaire who adopted a homeless boy and acknowledged him as his son. Journalists tried to smear John on the orders of his competitors, but they didn't gain anything from it because the man didn't fall for the provocation. It used to matter to John's father what the journalists thought, but he had been dead for several years. One day, John decided to give an interview. He honestly discussed the wrong decisions he had made in the past and his mistakes, hoping that someone would follow his advice and not step on the rake that he had once stepped. The head of the hospital where Lizzie worked was punished. John tried to make sure that the man regretted what he had done and remembered until the end of his days that such inhuman behavior was unacceptable. Mrs. Garrison spent the rest of her days in the best place, where she was taken care of, and her painful sensations were relieved. Lizzie was grateful to John for taking care of that woman. She saw that the man had changed, and that's why she forgave him. Roger looked only at his wife. She was pale and drained. Her beautiful eyes conveyed fear and a clear plea. Now only her face, swollen with tears, did not express contempt and hatred for him. The courtroom was silent and anxious as everyone awaited the verdict. The eyes of those present were fixed upon the judge who was about to pronounce his verdict. There was no one in the courtroom except his Julia, who did not wish the worst for him now. And there was no one in the whole world for Roger except for his beloved wife. Throughout the entire last court session, Roger did not look towards the family of the deceased old man, but he knew he would only see hatred in their eyes. Roger himself would hate someone who killed a member of his family. In the eyes of all present, he was a monster who had killed the old man and fled without even trying to help him. Roger's mother raised him alone. She died before he turned 10 years old, and he grew up in the village with his grandmother, who also passed away 5 years after his mother. How painful it is to see all this hatred in people's eyes, thought Roger, as he sat on the defendant's bench. But it would be 1,000 times harder for me to see my mother and grandmother killed by grief. It's good that they don't see this shame now. 4 years, pronounced the judge as the verdict. The judge's words hit him like a heavy blacksmith's hammer on his head. Julia cried out loud, and the people in the courtroom were dissatisfied. Someone shouted about vigilante justice, and someone demanded a longer sentence. And Roger thought only of the fact that he would not see his baby come into the world, would not meet Julia from the maternity hospital, would not walk with her, the baby, in the public garden, and would not teach the baby to take his first steps. "Julia, everything will be fine. Think about the baby. Don't get nervous," he shouted when she tried to break through to him. On the way out of the hall, he heard her parting words. "Roger, we'll wait for you." He was ready to do anything for Julia, but knew that clearly, and now he accepted the punishment instead of her. She definitely wouldn't have handled it. "And I'm a man, I'm strong, and I'll endure everything I have to endure. I will return, and we will be together again. We will have a baby," as she said. "I will only think about them, my beloved Julia and the baby. Everything else doesn't matter." These thoughts filled his head, not giving him the opportunity to think about his own fate. And his fate at the moment was very unenviable. After receiving 5 years of general regime for hitting a pedestrian, Roger lost everything dear to him. The scariest thing about this situation was that all the people, as it seemed to him now, hated and cursed him. And all his fault was only that he loved and pitied Julia very much. The first night in the prison, where he was brought closer to the evening, passed without any special incidents, although his imagination had already painted him a horrible picture of prison cruelty and lawlessness. To some extent, Roger was lucky. The prisoners with whom he ended up in the same cell were mostly ordinary people who had violated the law out of carelessness or stupidity. Lying in the cell on a hard mattress and staring into the darkness of the night, he replayed everything that had happened to him over the past few months. Roger remembered that terrible night when he was waiting for Julia from a party with her friends and was very worried that she was not answering his calls. He felt like it had just happened yesterday. Roger saw his wife's trembling figure standing on the doorstep that night. She looked crazy and smelled of alcohol. Stammering, she tried to explain something to him. "Roger, it's not my fault. I don't understand how he ended up on the road. Yes, I drank a little at the party, but I didn't want to leave my car there, and he jumped out of the darkness, and I didn't understand where he came from. He remained lying there. I didn't stop. I was scared." Roger couldn't understand what Julia was trying to say to him at the time. It wasn't until later that the meaning of her words finally reached him. Julia had killed a man. This thought didn't allow him to concentrate on anything else. Roger, what will happen to me now? His wife cried and grabbed his hands. And if he died, am I a murderer? Oh no! She looked like a child trying to find protection from someone stronger, an adult. All thoughts in Roger's head were tangled in one huge knot, and he could not understand how to unravel it until Julia said just 2 words. I'm pregnant. Roger, what will happen to me? I can't go to jail. I just wanted to tell you tonight that I'm pregnant and will have a baby. After hearing this, the knot in Roger's head unravelled by itself, and the solution to the problem became so obvious. Calm down now. Why didn't you tell me you were pregnant before? I wouldn't have let you go to that party. Why did you drink? Roger hugged his wife. If they find your car, I'll tell the police that I was driving tonight and I hit a man. Julia didn't try to dissuade him, she just cried. Roger ran to the garage and inspected the car. There were traces of blood, a dent on the hood, and a cracked bumper. In a hurry, without thinking anything, he tried to wipe with a rag all the prints that Julia could have left in the car. He wiped the steering wheel, door handles, and then, fidgeting and nervous, he started grabbing with his hands all the protruding objects in the car, trying to leave as many of his fingerprints as possible. When the police arrived at the doorstep of their house, Roger already had a clearly formulated proof of his guilt. He didn't even intend to deny that it was his car that hit the man to death that night. Julia pretended to be surprised in front of the police, saying that she didn't even suspect what had happened. She threw herself into her husband's arms when he was taken away. Roger, what have you done? How could you? We're going to have a baby. She reproached her husband so convincingly that Roger himself began to gradually believe that the death of the old man was solely on his conscience. What? The boy can't sleep. Roger heard an old voice from the pitch-black darkness of the cell. I couldn't get to sleep at first either. Don't worry, you'll get used to it. It turned out that his night interlocutor was a strong old man named Richard. Roger told Richard what brought him to prison, not hiding his real story. Yeah, I messed up big time too. Richard wanted to vent to Roger about his soul. I've been sitting here for 6 months, and for what? And that scumbag I barely touched. It wouldn't really have hurt to knock him out. I worked as a ranger. Some scoundrels started wreaking havoc in my forest. Whether they were poachers or just idiots having fun, I don't know. They shot a moose once, and the fawn was left without a mother. It would have been fine if they just were hunting for food, but they were just causing damage. They shot swans on the lake, burned squirrels for entertainment. So John, my assistant, and I decided to track them down. John was still a greenhorn. He looked very like my late son. I protected him like he was my own, and those wretches fired at him when he chased after them. I couldn't hold back. I fired once, twice. Who knew the pellets would hit one guy in the soft spot? John was more seriously hurt, and those scumbags didn't even flinch. But now I'm the one who got sentenced. That wounded parasite turned out to be the prosecutor's son. They were just having innocent fun with their friends, they say, and I, the villain, wanted to kill them. And here I am. Don't be afraid, Roger. There are people living here too. Somehow we'll get through this and stand by each other through thick and thin. No one will be able to scare us. And so Roger started serving his sentence. He got used to it over time. Julia called him and passed on messages, promising to come visit him. Roger asked her about their child. He was eager to know whether they were having a boy or a girl. He couldn't wait for their meeting, to put his hand on his beloved's belly and feel their baby kicking. He came up with names and eagerly told Richard about the smart son or little princess he and Julia will have. But one day, his wife gave him unpleasant news. "You won't have a son or daughter. I lost the baby a long time ago. I just didn't want to upset you." Julia's cold, almost indifferent voice washed over him like cold water. "Julia, how could you not tell me? When did this happen?" Roger couldn't gather his thoughts when a cruel suspicion suddenly crept into his mind. "Julia, have you ever been pregnant?" "Think what you want if you don't believe me." His wife responded sharply and hung up. Since then, Julia didn't write or call him and wouldn't answer his calls. Roger couldn't find peace, blaming himself for asking his wife such a cruel, heartless question that undoubtedly hurt a woman who had lost her child. So, when Richard was released from prison, Roger asked him to go to his home first thing and find out how his beloved Julia was doing. He wrote her a letter begging for forgiveness for his cruel accusation, expressing his love for her and asking her to at least let him know how she was doing. A couple of days later, Roger heard Richard's voice on the phone. "Listen, son, don't do anything stupid. I don't know how to tell you this, but your wife seems to have left a long time ago. The house is empty. I asked the neighbours. They say they haven't seen her in 2 years. Apparently, she's moved to the capital. That's not the worst part. The most important thing is that she's alive and well. Thank you, Richard. I'll find her myself when I get out. She's really angry with me, it seems." 2 years had passed. Roger stood in front of a boarded-up, abandoned house, shooing away a nosy neighbour with annoyance. "Don't make up stories, ma'am. You're a well-known fantasist." "You see, Roger, she fooled you. Everyone here knows that. As soon as they put you in the jail, she immediately started an affair with some guy from the city. Go to Megan, her friend from the grocery store. She knows exactly what happened." Listening to the slightly frightened Megan, his wife's former classmate, Roger began to realize that all these years he had been a complete fool. "You don't blame her, Roger. You went to jail, and she met a guy from the capital on the internet. He came to see her in his fancy car and proposed to her. Why should she sit here alone in the middle of nowhere?" said Megan. "What a wretch," Roger muttered through his teeth. "You just don't look for Julia. She's got little kids now. Twins were born last year. You won't hurt her, will you?" frightened the chatty friend. "I've had enough of your Julia," muttered Roger, his head spinning, his throat constricted. He spat loudly and left, slamming the door loudly. Days and nights merged into one endless chaos for Roger, who couldn't distinguish between days and weeks in his drunken stupor. He recalled Richard's stories and felt like a wild animal, shot in the flank by poachers, and losing all desire to live and fight. The realization that the one he had ruined his life for had betrayed him, cutting all the threads that connected him to this life, left him killing himself with alcohol every day. "Is anyone home?" A high-pitched female voice came from under the window. Roger didn't want to answer. He had nothing left to buy alcohol with today, and he was in a terrible mood. He just lay there staring at the ceiling, hoping that his splitting headache would shut off his consciousness in one moment and he wouldn't think, suffer, or live anymore. "Hey, Roger, are you home?" Someone called persistently under the window. Roger reluctantly pulled himself up to the open window. He looked into the blue eyes of some girl. "What do you want?" he grumbled irritably. "I'm Elaine, your neighbour. I've been wanting to visit you." "You're my neighbour? But you never come to visit me or invite me over." "Elaine? The one who used to beg for apples for my grandma all the time?" Roger tried to remember. "That was a long time ago," Elaine laughed. "You might as well remember the time of the dinosaurs. It's been almost 20 years. "Wow, you've grown up, neighbour. Do you have something to drink by any chance?" Roger decided to take advantage of the girl's friendliness. Elaine became serious and said in a completely different tone, "You've had enough to drink. All the neighbours don't know how to help you. I know you're grieving, but it's no reason to destroy yourself. I'll bring you some hot broth and mint tea. After that, I'll make some herbal tea for you. My grandmother taught me how to help people cope with alcohol addiction. I won't leave you alone. You'll drink some tea now, get some rest, and then we'll go for a walk in the forest. It's so beautiful there. The birds are singing, and you'll forget about your troubles." And so it happened. Elaine took it upon herself to save Roger. She had loved him since childhood, but back then the age difference was too great, and the guy didn't pay any attention to the feisty, funny neighbour girl. But she always remembered him and couldn't watch quietly as he killed himself with alcohol. Every visit from Elaine was like a ray of light in Roger's dark and stuffy life. She brought joy and light into his home, dispelling all the gloomy thoughts with her laughter. Roger changed that day. He quit drinking, got a job, and seriously thought about proposing to Elaine. Only one thing stopped his thoughts of marrying her. Elaine's parents, and even the girl herself, wouldn't want to tie their fate to a former prisoner. "But why do you need me, Elaine? I was in prison." He tried to talk to the girl. "I'm not stupid or blind. Everyone in the village knows who your wife was. And from the first day, everyone only discussed how you covered for her and went to jail instead. You're a very good person, and I love you." Elaine's words stirred up such a storm of feelings in Roger's soul that he grabbed the girl in his arms and started spinning her around the room. "How I love you, Elaine!" Roger stopped, put the girl down on the floor, and looking into her eyes said, "Will you marry me? I've been waiting for this for more than 10 years. She laughed happily. "Of course I will be your wife." Roger was finally happy again. They were preparing for the wedding. He decided to find Richard and invite him to be the godfather at the wedding. But Richard's phone didn't answer. Roger remembered the name of the village where his prison friend was from, and on the first day off, he went with his bride to search for the old gamekeeper. In the village they arrived at, everyone knew Richard, and Roger easily found his dilapidated house on the edge of the forest. When they entered his house, Roger immediately realized that something was wrong with him. The old man lay in bed and didn't even turn his head at their greeting. Richard had a high fever, and he was breathing heavily. At first glance it was clear that the elderly man needed urgent medical attention. The couple took him to the district hospital, and while the doctors cured his advanced pneumonia, Roger didn't leave the elderly man alone and sat by his bed for days. They decided with Elaine that they would take Richard with them, and when his life was already out of danger, they took him to their village. Immediately after the wedding, Roger began building a big house next to the one he had lived in with his grandmother as a boy. Elaine was expecting their first child, and Roger was overjoyed about this. Richard had completely recovered and now tried to help them in everything. One day, Megan, the classmate and friend of Julia, came to Roger when he was at work. "Roger, I didn't dare come to your house, but we need to talk. Oh, how we need to." What Megan told him left Roger completely confused. It turned out that his ex-wife wanted to come back to him and asked Megan to probe the ground regarding getting rid of Elaine from her path. "What nonsense, Megan! Did you tell her that I was married?" "Yes, I told her everything, but Julia is sure that you still love her, that Elaine is no rival for her, and that you will forgive and take her back." "I can't believe my ears. You told me that she has a beautiful, wealthy husband and children. Why does she need me?" "Well, Roger, let me tell you a secret. Julia's husband caught her with their driver, like in a bad joke. He returned from a business trip at the wrong time, probably on purpose. He had long suspected Julia of having affairs on the side. Well, you understand, children in daycare, husband at work. She got bored. In general, her husband caught them red-handed in their bedroom and threw her out of the house, literally. She's at some friends now. Her husband hired lawyers and wants to get custody of the children. She doesn't seem to object. Am I her backup plan or something? Roger, my business is only to warn you. Your Elaine is as simple as a calf compared to Julia, and she's a beauty. She always has been, and now she's a real socialite from the capital. Well, let her stay there in the capital. Did her driver leave her too? He disowned her too, lost his job and ran off somewhere. In any case, I have passed on the news to you, so wait for her to visit. Let her not even think about it. I won't accept her, so just tell her. I'll tell her, but you know her. She makes her own decisions. 3 weeks had passed. The small but friendly family had developed a habit of drinking tea. During one of these tea parties, they heard the gate creaking. Julia was standing on the path leading to the garden with suitcases in her hands. "Roger, I'm back," she pretended to cheerfully shout at Roger. Richard was the first to stand up from the table, while Roger and Elaine, shocked, were trying to figure out what to say and do. "Sweetheart, let's go. I'll accompany you to the gate. Go in peace and don't bother good people," said Richard firmly but politely to the uninvited guest. "You don't understand. This is my home. I used to live here. I have nowhere else to go now. My husband kicked me out. He took away my children and threw me out onto the street. Do you understand? He just got jealous of me out of nowhere and accused me of cheating on him. But Roger, I just made a mistake," Julia replied. "You made a very serious mistake, mate. If you thought you could just appear in Roger's life like this, we won't let you manipulate him again. Leave. This is the last time I'm telling you, and I'm not joking. I already went to jail for shooting one scumbag, and I won't hesitate to do it again for you. I'm itching to beat you up. I'm not afraid of it anymore," Richard warned. Frightened, Julia picked up her suitcases and rushed to the exit. Roger and Elaine looked at the old man with amazement, and he shrugged, smiled, and asked, "What's wrong? Am I wrong? Let's have some tea, or it'll get completely cold." And they all laughed together. Marissa's day didn't start well. Her head was pounding with pain, and all she wished for were to be far away from the noisy office, preferably by a cool river or by the sea. Marissa imagined the gentle waves rolling onto the sand and the warm sun tickling her shoulders, and relaxed a little. But she didn't have much time to daydream. Her boss was waiting for the quarterly report. Marissa was his favourite, the most responsible and punctual of his subordinates, practically his right hand, and this unspoken title did not give her peace, so Marissa constantly felt the burden of responsibility. Suddenly the office door opened, and her assistant, Abby, announced that a visitor had come with a personal matter. Marissa was surprised. "Strange, I'm not expecting anyone, but okay, tell her to come in." Marissa straightened her back, adjusted her hair with a barely noticeable movement, and slipped her feet into her shoes, which she had kicked off under the table to relax a little. A woman about 10 years younger than Marissa entered the office. She introduced herself as Jessica and looked challengingly at Marissa. "I came to tell you to leave Zachary alone," the visitor boldly declared, and every word echoed unpleasantly in Marissa's head. "How am I bothering him? And why should I leave my own husband?" Marissa calmly asked, although she was very surprised by the demands of the stranger. "Because you're keeping him. You're no longer young, and he feels sorry for you. That he loves me." Gasping for breath, in the midst of her emotions, Jessica explained that she was an orphan who had fallen madly in love with Zachary, Marissa's husband. Zachary felt the same way, but he was unable to be with Jessica because of his wife, who refused to let him go, citing an incurable illness or some other reason. According to Jessica, poor Zachary was completely tormented, torn between his feelings and his duty. "And besides, we're going to have a child," Jessica shouted so loudly that the entire office heard her. "Get out of our way! Don't leave the child fatherless! You're already getting old. Why do you need a husband who's only with you out of pity? Give him freedom. He's still young at heart. Let him be happy." Marissa couldn't hide her surprise. She was certainly disappointed that Zachary had prepared such a gift for her on their 10th wedding anniversary. But on the other hand, the situation seemed funny to her. "Don't worry, I'll talk to my husband today. It's time for me to go to a nursing home, and he still has his whole life ahead of him. Go, and I'll take care of everything," Marissa said, looking at the confused girl with a smirk. When Jessica left the office, Marissa tiredly leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes again. She and Zachary had been married for 10 years, and at first didn't think about children, focusing on their careers. A couple of years ago, they finally decided it was time to have a child, but it didn't work out. Marissa thought it was because of stress, as both she and her husband had stressful jobs. But then she decided to check their health. And just yesterday she picked up the results of their tests, where it clearly stated that Zachary cannot have children. That's why Jessica's story about her pregnancy cheered Marissa up, and now she most wanted to talk to her husband and see his reaction. Marissa, citing poor health, left work early and went home. "We need to talk seriously," her husband began as soon as Marissa entered the room. "Jessica came to see you today." "Oh, your mistress. Yes, she came. She told me I'm too old for you, and it's time to set you free. And she also mentioned that she couldn't resist your charm and was now waiting for a child from you." "Well, why are you like that? Yes, I'm guilty, but I wasn't going to leave you. We've been through so much together, and Jessica, she's so young and naive. She's not to blame for anything. If she offended you, I'll talk to her and she'll apologize." Marissa felt herself starting to boil with anger. Not only did his mistress have the audacity to come to her workplace and say all that, but her husband clearly thought she was a complete fool. "Zachary, do you even hear yourself? I don't need her apologies on your continued presence in this house. Pack your things and leave immediately before I start a real scandal." Zachary lowered his head and went to pack his things. Already standing at the threshold with his bag, he hesitated and made one more attempt to fix everything. "Marissa, let's not get too heated. Maybe we can somehow fix everything. I still love you." "My dear hubby, I have said everything, and besides, what are you talking about? You have a child on the way." "Oh yes, the child," sighed Zachary. "Then of course it's better for me to leave." He opened the door, but Marissa suddenly called out to him and handed him the test results. She advised him to study them more carefully and slammed the door in front of him. She heard Zachary didn't leave, and apparently trying to understand what was written in the document. When he finally realized, he began screaming hysterically and pounding on the door in a fit of hysteria. "Marissa, what does this all mean? Explain it to me." "That's not my question, Zachary. Let your darling Jessica explain to you who the father of her child is. Leave me alone," Marissa shouted through the closed door. After hearing Zachary call the elevator and leave, Marissa felt a moment of sympathy for him. However, she quickly remembered that he wasn't worth it. Suddenly she realized how tired she was from the day's events. She went into the guest room, lay down on the couch, covered herself with a big fluffy blanket, and finally allowed herself to cry. It was so painful to realize that she had been betrayed. Marissa reminisced about how she and Zachary had bumped into each other on the street almost 12 years ago. At the time, he was a clumsy and nearsighted medical student who knocked a box out of her hands. Despite his nervous stuttering, Marissa had helped him to believe in himself, and he eventually underwent laser eye surgery and transformed into a confident and handsome young doctor. Marissa's friends envied her for having such a great partner, but Marissa believed him, because Zachary had always said that he loves only his Marissa. The betrayal of her husband had deprived Marissa of her last strength, and this could not help but affect her work. Her boss, a very fair leader who valued his employees, noticed this and, with a tone that tolerated no objections, sent Marissa to rest by the sea. Marissa tried to choose a quiet place away from popular noisy resorts. For the first few days she simply lay on the beach, enjoying the warm rays of the sun, the gentle sea breeze, and the sound of the waves. But after a few days she became bored and began discreetly observing the other vacationers. Her attention was particularly drawn to a young man, about 25 years old, who was dashing towards the waves with childlike enthusiasm and frolicking on the shore with the children. Some kind of freak, thought Marissa, or wild. Has he never seen the sea before? An adult, but behaves like a boy. On the one hand, the young man's behaviour caused her bewilderment, but on the other hand, Marissa was interested in observing his childishness. His unbridled energy plunged Marissa into childhood, when she too could allow herself to be just as spontaneous. Maybe Jessica was right, and I really did turn into an old woman, Marissa unexpectedly thought to herself. In the evening, Marissa began to feel sad and went to the nearest bar. Although she had avoided such places for a week, the thought that she had become too boring and old depressed her, and she decided to act against her principles and try to have some fun in a noisy company. At the bar she noticed the same guy from the beach. He also noticed her and even waved, inviting her to sit next to him. Marissa pretended not to notice and took a seat at the other end of the bar. "Hi," she heard next to her. "May I sit down?" Marissa looked up and saw the same young man again. Unexpectedly for herself, she agreed and let the guy sit down. He introduced himself as Cameron, and she also said her name, trying to seem as indifferent as possible. "I noticed that you didn't really like how I behaved today on the beach. I know that I acted like a child, but that's really how I felt. The first time at the sea." "Are you serious?" Marissa was surprised. Cameron nodded and told her that his parents insisted on the trip. The guy lived in a small town and immediately after school started working with his father in an auto repair shop. After 5 years of work without vacation, his parents decided to make a gift to their son on his 25th birthday and forcibly sent him to rest in these beautiful places? Cameron asked if Marissa had been to the sea before, and she simply replied that she had been several times. Marissa could, of course, say that she was a successful and mature woman who had visited many resorts around the world, but for some reason she did not want to elevate herself in front of this naive working man. Somehow, imperceptibly, they got to talking, even though they had nothing in common except for loneliness and a love for the sea. Cameron was too simple for Marissa, but his youth, directness, sincerity and overflowing energy did their job, and after a few cocktails, Marissa unexpectedly found herself in the arms of a new acquaintance. To her surprise, Marissa realized that she had never been as satisfied in bed with anyone else as she had been with Cameron. Zachary was handsome, but not particularly gentle in bed. However, Marissa loved her husband and forgave him. Now, looking at the sleeping Cameron, she could not understand how she could have lived like this before. By morning, the fog of passion and alcohol in her head had cleared, and the woman looked at things realistically. She understood that these relationships had no future. Yes, they were good, but that was it, and everyone had to return to their usual life. Marissa cautiously slipped out from under the covers, left Cameron's room, and then gathering her things, left the hotel the same morning. She was ashamed of her escape because Cameron didn't deserve it, but she could not act otherwise. On the way home, Marissa burst into tears, not knowing why. At work, she immersed herself in her papers, trying not to think about her loneliness. But in the evenings, she recalled the sunny beach and the cheerful guy jumping among the waves again and again. At times, Marissa regretted not leaving Cameron her phone number or address, but then convinced herself that nothing would have worked out between her and the poor guy from the car repair shop anyway. Marissa had tried to meet people through social networks and even went on a couple of dates, but the empty stories of her companions about vacations at expensive resorts, prestigious cars, and the like did not interest her at all. Her thoughts constantly returned to Cameron. Zachary had tried to come back into her life several times. After the DNA test accurately confirmed that the child was not his, he parted with Jessica. Just imagine, she wasn't even an orphan. She was constantly deceiving me, he complained to his ex-wife. Forgive me, Marissa. We were so good together. Let's start over. Zachary, I haven't been interested in you for a long time. I advise you to find a normal woman and live with her peacefully, and let me fix my life too. I'll never be able to forgive you for your meanness, especially since now I know that you're not the best and honest man in the world, and besides, you weren't a great lover, Marissa retorted. Zachary was shocked by his ex-wife's words and decided that she was just taking revenge on him out of spite and hitting him where it hurt most. But Marissa really thought that way. After a night with Cameron, she realized that there were no true feelings in her relationship with her husband. It is unknown how Marissa's life would have turned out if it were not for her assistant Abby. The woman had become good friends lately and often sat together in a cafe after work, and on weekends went bowling or skating. When the hot summer arrived, Marissa felt how the heated city was pressing on her with its noise and stuffiness. She began to suffer from migraines again, and her reluctance to sit in the office all day and then return to her stuffy apartment only grew. Abby, I'm completely broken, she complained to her friend. Let's go somewhere for the weekend. Only it must be a place near a river or a lake. I swear I'll get in the water and sit there until we leave. So let's go to my grandmother's, Abby exclaimed happily. She lives in a small town. There's a river and a forest around there. At first, Marissa was hesitant about staying at Abby's grandmother's house, since Abby was her granddaughter and Marissa was a stranger. However, Abby assured Marissa that her grandmother was a very hospitable person, and Marissa eventually agreed to stay. On Friday evening, the women arrived at Abby's grandmother's house and found her waiting for them in the garden at a set table. Though they tried to refuse a treat at such a late hour, But the old lady wouldn't listen to anything. "Nothing will happen to your figures. You'll swim tomorrow. It's great fitness," laughed Mrs. Sandberg. "Yeah, sure, only I don't know how to swim," laughed Abby. "How?" wondered Marissa. "And I thought that tomorrow you and I will swim to the other side to race against each other." Abby waved her hands and warned Marissa to give up the idea right away because the river was treacherous due to its cold underground currents, and even the strongest and bravest guys from the town did not dare to swim to the other side. Marissa did not believe it and even laughed, thinking that Abby was just cowardly because she couldn't swim, but Mrs. Sandberg also confirmed that it was better to be careful with their river. But Marissa was unstoppable. Early in the morning, while her friend was still in bed, Marissa, wearing a swimsuit and a light robe, ran to the river. A fog was floating over the river, creating a quiet and calm atmosphere. Enchanted by the beauty of nature, Marissa ran and plunged into the invigorating coolness of the river. After making a couple of dozens of strong strokes, she found herself in the middle of the river and felt an incredible calmness. "And where is the dangerous river here?" she snorted, and started to swim towards the opposite shore. But it didn't take a minute for Marissa to feel the icy cold. Her muscles seized with unbearable cramps, and the woman, in despair, began to call for help. Marissa shouted with all her might, but she realized in her heart that hardly anyone would hear her at this hour. Most likely, these were the last minutes of her life. She lost consciousness. Marissa came to her senses on the shore. It turned out that in response to her cry for help, a guy who was sitting on the riverbank with a fishing rod had rushed into the river. If it weren't for his desire to fish early in the morning and his ability to perform artificial respiration, that morning would most likely have been Marissa's last. But this was not the only miraculous coincidence. Looking at her savior, Marissa couldn't believe her eyes. "Cameron, is that you? Or am I hallucinating?" "Yes, Marissa, it's me. How did you get here? And anyway, where had you disappeared then? I almost went crazy. Did you feel bad with me?" Marissa looked at Cameron shyly and confessed she had never felt as good with anyone as she did then, and she was just scared. An hour later, they sat on the spacious terrace of his house, eating delicious apple pie and drinking tea. "Son, maybe you should introduce us after all," Mrs. Beasley reproached her son. "This is Marissa, my fiancée," Cameron confidently replied. Marissa even coughed in surprise. "She came here yesterday and stayed at Mrs. Sandberg." Mrs. Beasley was surprised why her son's fiancée didn't stay in their house. Cameron calmly lied, saying that Marissa follows strict rules and refuses to live under one roof with her fiancé before the wedding, and therefore, in his opinion, they needed to get married as soon as possible. "And don't you want to ask me?" Marissa whispered in protest. "Didn't you remember that you already agreed? We're submitting the application the day after tomorrow. Mum, she is probably just overheated in the sun," Cameron smiled. "I thought so," Mrs. Beasley smiled, shaking her head. A noisy wedding took place in the town a month later. Cameron admired Marissa, and she eagerly awaited the moment when she would be alone with her beloved again, hear his passionate words, and dissolve in his tender embrace. The young couple were so absorbed in each other that they thought they were alone, and only their love and happiness reigned around them. 9 months later, Marissa gave birth to a son for her husband. That's how one scandalous visit from a brazen mistress sharply changed Marissa's life. I should probably thank Jessica, the young mother thought, when she first held her baby, born from her beloved man. Martha sat at the bar of the nightclub and involuntarily remembered the theory that a person's life is a series of black and white stripes. Some psychologists often said that life is like a zebra, and if a person is on a black stripe, then they should not despair because a bright future awaits ahead. Others jokingly responded that one should stock up on white paint and fix the situation to their liking. However, these pieces of advice did not comfort Martha, but irritated her, because she did not observe any enlightenment in the series of troubles and did not foresee it in the future. "I have a feeling that in my past life I destroyed cute kittens cruelly," complained Martha to her best friend Catherine, who accompanied her tonight. "Otherwise, why did such torments fall on my lot?" Catherine immediately grabbed Martha's hand and started reassuring her that she should not think in this way. "Thoughts are material. You should think about good, positive things, do you understand? So that the universe hears you. By the way, the universe is very sensitive to words, requests, and thoughts. It always responds to powerful energy charges. You have to watch your thoughts and words. Many things come true." Catherine was obsessed with esotericism, horoscopes, mantras, and affirmations. She even chose boyfriends according to their zodiac sign. Martha was her antipode and was sure that in this life one must achieve everything by their own efforts. A promotion at work is through hard work and professionalism. A good figure is through training in the gym, not through repeating phrases like, "I am successful and beautiful." Now, having drunk enough cocktails and being in a very irritated mood, she raised her eyebrows skeptically and snapped her fingers, demanding from the universe, "Okay, I want Johnny Depp to bring me a suitcase full of money, then take me to his Hollywood, and let my ex-husband bite his elbows with envy. I want my test results." What a medical joke. "Hear me, universe, do it." Then she waited a little and looked at her friend with a feigned disappointment. Maybe the connection is bad here and the universe does not respond. Maybe it should change its mobile plan or something else. Catherine did not comment on her friend's childish behaviour, and she could not be offended by her now, at least not now. "You know, I still can't believe it," she admitted with sympathy and worry, looking at her best friend. "Maybe the test results were not yours." "What do you mean?" Martha snorted, and finishing her sweet cocktail in one gulp, asked the bartender to repeat the drink. "Well, maybe they mixed them up," her friend guessed. Martha looked eloquently at her and shook her head. She never understood the ease with which her friend approached everything, and sometimes she even envied her. Catherine fluttered through life like a butterfly. Everything was easy for her, and if unpleasant things happened, she managed to find the positives in them. At that moment, Martha mentally looked at her own life and realized with horror that she had nothing to hold on to. Throughout her life, she had been a diligent girl, the pride of her parents and teachers, the one her classmates and neighbourhood kids looked up to. She graduated from high school with honours and went on to study advertising and public relations at the university. After graduating, Martha married Stephen, whom she met during her first year at university. Immediately after the wedding, she found a job in her field of study. 3 years after graduating from university, Martha became the chief editor at an image agency. The experience was interesting and varied. Among the agency's clients were large medical centres, auto repair shops, and shopping centres. And she mostly wrote texts for corporate newspapers and magazines aimed at elevating the company's image to unprecedented heights. Martha loved her job, but she was paid criminally little. Her boss piled all the work on her, but didn't raise her salary. He constantly convinced Martha that they were critically short on money, although he managed to fly to prestigious resorts several times a year. Martha, with her syndrome of being a meek, straight-A student, swallowed her boss's explanations for a long time before finally realizing the truth. A month ago, she accidentally saw a vacancy for a PR manager at the prestigious advertising agency and quickly applied for it. The company's clients included well-known brands, stars, and influential people in the country. Trying to get into the company was a bold decision, but Martha decided that those who don't take risks will be sitting in a stuffy office while their boss warms his bones on the Seychelles Islands. A few days after making the decision, she came for an interview. Our boss loves creative people, always gives them a chance even if they have little experience. But you have tons of it. I'm sure he'll appreciate your candidacy. He's currently away, but he'll reply by email in a month, said Anna, the personnel recruiter, to Martha. But the sad truth is, he's a demon in human form, so be prepared for anything if you get hired. We pay handsomely, but his requirements are high. He has no tolerance for anyone. He hates lateness, delayed projects, excuses. He doesn't like many things. He's a very difficult man. Besides, he's incredibly handsome. But he doesn't look at anyone. Saying this, Anna pouted petulantly. It was clear that she had already tried to get close to the boss, but it didn't work out, and it hurt her deeply. To give her credit, she was an incredibly attractive blonde. Her immodest neckline showed off her ample third size, and her plump lips shone with pink gloss. However, the appearance of the future boss didn't interest Martha. She was only interested in the job, and a week later, the mysterious boss approved her candidacy. Martha waved goodbye to her old boss and fled to her new job. They tried to keep her, even promising her the moon, but Martha no longer believed them. Martha enjoyed working with the new team. They threatened each other with the boss like children with a witch. Giggling and wailing could often be heard by the water cooler or in the ladies' room. Wait until Bradley comes back, then we'll see what you'll do. Although I know you'll be looking for a new job. He won't leave here anyone for their good looks. Martha worked at a new place for almost a month and felt like it was a new, wonderful and happy stage in her life. However, a visit to the doctor dashed her hopes. One day, Martha felt unwell and immediately ran to the nearest private clinic due to her paranoia from losing both of her parents. There, she received a bleak diagnosis. Unfortunately, your diagnosis is rare. The treatment will be complex and difficult. However, I cannot guarantee recovery, the doctor told her. But we will do everything in our power. Trust us. And if I don't treat it? Martha asked, looking only at the trash can in the doctor's office, afraid that hearing such news would make her sick and cause her to spill out all of her breakfast. The doctor was surprised by her question and shook his head. Don't treat it? He repeated in annoyance. Then I give you 6 months, maybe a year. 6 months, Martha repeated thoughtfully. That same evening, she told her husband everything the doctor had said, adding, I learned what awaits me if I go to the clinic. I will simply spend my last days away from my loved ones, under some drugs that will keep my soul in my body and prevent me from living peacefully. Tubes will be sticking out of me, and my bald head will always be in a cap. I realized that I don't want this, so I've decided not to undergo treatment. After listening to his wife, Stephen was first frightened and then angry. So that means you're not going to get treatment? Are you out of your mind? If there's even one chance, we have to use it. No. Martha shook her head. There's no guarantee of recovery. I want to live the rest of my life in a sane state. Maybe even to the fullest. Maybe we could go on a trip together. I have been dreaming of it, but there was no time. I think now is the time. Do you remember how I wanted to go and see whales? It's unlikely, but at least dolphins? What whales, Martha? Her husband suddenly shouted. What dolphins? So that you can die of illness somewhere in the sea or a foreign country? And what am I supposed to do after that? They argued for a long time, but Martha was adamant. She realised that she had not accomplished too much in her life, and since she had an expiration date, she had to use the remaining time to the fullest. Not only did Stephen refuse to support his wife, he also betrayed her. The next day, Martha returned home early from work and found Stephen packing his things. "Are we still going on vacation? It's strange that you're only packing for one," Martha said, standing in the doorway of their bedroom. Stephen, who hadn't heard his wife come in, jumped when he saw her. He looked away, cursed, and then looked at her with anger. "You know it's your fault. Do you think anyone wants to watch someone die? I've read what's waiting for you. I can't be a caregiver for a sick person. I'm leaving for Alethia's." "To Alethea?" Martha asked, not feeling anger or offence for some reason, only mild disappointment. "You mean that one who, according to you, was just a friend and colleague, right? Your lovely secretary?" Stephen owned a small company that built private homes. Martha was the only one who supported him from the beginning. Back then, she worked alone to support their young family, while her husband tried to develop the business. Martha worked on advertising and PR for the company at nights. She even found clients, acting as a manager. Alethea appeared as a secretary 2 years later, when Stephen had already achieved success. Catherine, Martha's friend, never liked Alethea. She usually told Martha, "That secretary looks at your Stephen too often and laughs too loudly at his unfunny jokes. She really annoys me. If only she had seen Stephen before he met you. He was a zero, and now he struts around. But you're the one who deserves all the credit." However, Martha, not being a jealous or scandalous person, believed Stephen's assurances that there could be nothing between him and Alethea. As it turned out, her naivety played a cruel joke on her. "And how long have you been with her?" Martha asked, looking at the pile of crumpled clothes that her husband had barely managed to stuff into his suitcase. "For some time," muttered her husband through gritted teeth. Martha nodded, then went to the kitchen to make herself some tea. She waited until the front door closed behind her unfaithful spouse, before throwing the still full cup against the wall. She looked at the light brown stain on the wallpaper, turned to the shattered pieces of her favourite mug, and bitterly cried. Martha sat on the floor, hugging her knees. She felt like her life had shattered, just like that cup, into many sharp pieces. Martha lived like this for another week. She took sick leave from work, although she knew what it would mean for her, as she was still on probation. However, she couldn't find the strength to even take a shower, let alone smile at her colleagues or generate creative ideas. Then Catherine visited Martha and, not taking no for an answer, commanded her to get dressed, put on some makeup and go to the bar. She even picked out a dress for Martha, a short red dress with thin straps. Catherine claimed that loud music, a good amount of alcohol and the club atmosphere would at least bring Martha to her senses a little bit. And she was right. However, it wasn't the flashing strobe lights or the music from the speakers that shook Martha up, but rather a man. A handsome brunette sat at the bar and ordered whiskey on the rocks from the bartender. He happened to be sitting across from the two friends. Martha briefly glanced at him, involuntarily noticing that the stranger was incredibly handsome. Well-defined cheekbones, dark, thick hair, tall, with a trendy haircut. He was dressed in a dark grey jacket, shirt and jeans, which only highlighted the difference between his broad shoulders and narrow waist. Catherine also noticed the young man and immediately leaned closer to her friend. "Who let the cover boy in here? I'm willing to bet my favourite designer purse, for which I haven't eaten in almost a month to buy, that behind all those layers of clothing is the perfect athletic body. Catherine whispered to her friend in one breath, "It looks like the universe heard you, but instead of an old Johnny Depp, Apollo descended from the heavens, dressed in expensive clothes." Martha laughed, but at that moment she was drinking a cocktail through a straw, which caused it to gurgle in the glass. "Well, damn!" Martha wiped her lips, putting down her glass, still giggling. Strangely enough, it was this awkward episode that caught the stranger's eye. He barely raised his eyebrows, and his lips twitched into a smile when he noticed Martha. Martha quickly turned away, continuing to chat with her friend on unrelated topics. However, the man had caught her attention so much that she couldn't stop thinking about him. After some time, Martha couldn't resist and stole another glance at him. To her surprise, she saw that the stranger was also looking in her direction. Noticing that their eyes had met, he gave the girl a charming smile. Martha, unexpectedly for herself, felt a wave of embarrassment. She was completely flustered under the gaze of his eyes. "He's looking at you. Listen, you have to go up to him," exclaimed Catherine excitedly. "What? Are you crazy?" exclaimed Martha, wide-eyed. "You're the crazy one if you intend to miss such a chance. The universe heard." "Say one more word about the universe, and I'll end our long-standing friendship, and I die alone in proud solitude," muttered Martha. "That's right, Martha. You've received the verdict, so what are you waiting for? Have fun. Remind me, have you done anything wild? Maybe you went skydiving, danced at a carnival, hitchhiked to some country? No? So why not at least flirt with this handsome guy? And if you end up spending the night with him?" Catherine exclaimed, waving her hands. Martha was surprised by her friend's suggestion. "With a stranger?" she exclaimed. "Yes!" Her friend raised her voice. "Yes! Why not? What's stopping you? Just a reminder, your idiot Stephen left you at the most difficult time in your life. That's not a reason to jump on the first person you meet," Martha muttered, hiding a smile. "Well, sorry, my dear, but you don't have much time to choose. You know, I wouldn't miss my chance. If he was staring at me, I would have already left with him." "So go meet your Johnny Depp," her friend insisted. "I'm not going to introduce myself. Are you crazy? I've never done that in clubs." "But you've seen many movies about it," the friend parried with expertise. "And none of them ended in a wedding, you know. Usually these people turn out to be maniacs. He might slip something into my drink now, and tomorrow you'll find my name in the Criminal Chronicle. And I want to live the rest of my life, even if it's short." "Martha!" The girl tried to interrupt her friend, pulling her by the hand. "Stop talking!" However, Martha, slightly tipsy, continued her tirade. "And besides, staring at strangers is rude, by the way," she murmured, stirring the contents of her glass with a straw, which loosened her tongue and allowed her imagination to run wild. "Especially if he's incredibly handsome. You know what the problem is? He knows that he is handsome. Such guys are usually terribly self-absorbed but empty. He's probably a narcissist, not an Apollo. I can imagine us making love under a mirrored ceiling for all of 5 minutes. He'll be trying to admire his reflection and how his muscles in his back and arms ripple." "Oh no!" Catherine unexpectedly groaned and, struggling with laughter, covered her blushing face with her hands. Martha looked at her friend in surprise, not understanding her reaction. The joke was amusing, but not to the extent that her shoulders shook with laughter. However, suddenly she heard a pleasant male voice behind her, and her friend's behaviour became obvious. "I don't have a mirrored ceiling in my bedroom, but we could move the bed to the closet. Then I would have a better view of my muscles. I prefer my glutes. That's why I squat with a barbell." The man answered the accusations thrown at him. Martha was stunned. She couldn't turn around to face him, watching her friend giggling uncontrollably. Meanwhile, The man's tone was clearly amused as he continued to respond to the accusations directed at him. "I swear I'm brought up enough not to stare at people. It's just that there was a bar mirror right behind you. I was looking at myself, like all narcissists like to do." Unable to hold it in, Catherine burst out laughing, while Martha blushed deeply. "Stop mocking me, please. You see, I'm so embarrassed," the girl muttered. "I really apologize." "I'll certainly forgive you if you allow me to treat you to a drink and prove that I am a good guy. To dispel your stereotypes, so to speak. You know, after your accusing speech, it's a matter of honour," replied the brunette. Martha found the strength to look up at the stranger. Up close he was even more handsome. "Wow, it's really late already," Catherine exclaimed, looking at her empty wrist on which there were no watches. "It's time for good girls like me to go to bed, so you can take my place. I don't mind. Her name is Martha. She likes sweet cocktails, and by the way, she's usually not so harmful. It's just a bad day." Catherine jumped off the high bar stool, giving way to the brunette, hung her bag on her shoulder, and tried to leave, waving goodbye. "What are you doing?" hissed Martha, grabbing her friend's hand and keeping her in place. "I am arranging your love life," whispered Catherine and winked at her friend. "But I don't even know him." "That's the point of getting to know each other," Catherine retorted. "Two strangers meet and get to know each other better. I hope he gets to know you well enough tonight," she giggled, making Martha blush again. "Don't hesitate to text me if something goes wrong, and I'll pick you up. Please, at least try to shake yourself up. Maybe this person will just help you distract," Catherine said, and disappeared into the crowd of dancing people. Martha sighed deeply, watching the blonde with her eyes, but then turned to her new interlocutor. "So, Martha," the man smiled softly, "I swear I'm not a maniac." "You know, any respectable maniac would say the same thing," Martha parried, but feeling very awkward after her embarrassment. "Fair enough," the man nodded. At first Martha felt tense. After all, her husband, whom she had loved all her conscious life, had recently left her. He left her treacherously, so she did not want to trust men. But whether it was the cocktails or the charming brunette was such a great conversationalist, she quickly relaxed. Soon Martha was laughing heartily at his jokes. It turned out that the young people were on the same wavelength. They easily found common topics, had many similar interests both in the professional sphere and in their personal lives. After an hour and a half, when Martha received an SMS from a friend, she realized that she did not want to leave the club because she enjoyed the company of the stranger so much. She wrote to Catherine that she would stay a little longer. In response, she received many smiley faces in the form of fireworks and a couple more that she was too shy to ask the meaning of. At that moment, a couple more drinks appeared on the bar counter, each with a generous amount of refreshing ice. "Cheers to our meeting," said the man, clinking his glass against Martha's. "Wait, what's your name?" Martha asked, horrified that she had been talking to the man for an hour. She could say she fell in love with him, but she hadn't even bothered to find out his name. "Bradley," the man introduced himself with a smile. "Oh, my boss has the same name. They say he's terribly nasty. He rarely shows up in the office because he's constantly travelling, but always finds someone to fire. Can you imagine? I've only worked there for a little time, but I've already heard horror stories," Martha said. "You know, I'm also a nasty boss," Bradley smirked. "I don't like my subordinates' laziness or dishonesty. I don't like unwillingness to admit mistakes and improve, unwillingness to take responsibility, or inappropriate criticism of another's work without alternative ideas." "Well, not many people could like that," Martha nodded approvingly. Just then a guy appeared behind her, impatient to place an order with the bartender. He unintentionally pushed her in the back, causing her to fall into Bradley's arms. "Whoops!" she exclaimed, finding herself in his strong embrace. She felt the brunette's perfume, tart with hints of wood. "Sorry," the guy apologized. "It's okay," the girl said, nodding at him and pulling away from Bradley. However, her hand remained in his palm. She didn't want to take it away, and the man didn't hurry to release her fingers. Instead, Bradley looked into her eyes. His fingers began to stroke the back of Martha's hand with gentle movements. She wanted to ask Bradley something else. For example, what company he led, or at least what perfume he used. Or did Bradley know that his grey eyes resembled morning foggy silver? But all her thoughts flew out of her head instantly. Martha again remembered how boringly she had lived her life. So the girl took a deep breath, as if about to dive into ice water, and then leaned forward, touching the man's lips with hers. He froze for a moment, not expecting this, but then responded to the kiss. Sparks ran through Martha's body, and lava seemed to flow in her veins instead of blood. Butterflies fluttered in her stomach, which she hadn't felt in a very long time, as if remembering that she was kissing a man in a nightclub in front of everyone. She broke the kiss and whispered, "Can we leave here?" The man's eyes darkened and his breathing became erratic. The chemical reaction that occurred between them conquered them both. He nodded, unable to answer. Taking Martha's hand, Bradley helped her get off the chair, and they left the club. Martha woke up, rubbing her eyes, but hesitating to open them. Her whole body hurt, and her head was heavy. "Good morning," she heard a male voice. Suddenly, she remembered where she was and with whom. Opening her eyes, she saw a man next to her. "Good morning," she replied, blushing. Bradley smiled and pulled the girl closer to him. She snuggled up on his chest, feeling a pleasant warmth and closeness. The night had been fantastic. Martha, being a little tipsy, didn't remember everything in detail, but what remained in her memory made her blood boil again. "Aren't you disappointed?" Bradley suddenly asked. "Why?" Martha raised her head. "Well, there are no mirrors here," the man reminded her, looking mischievously at Martha. She snorted and weakly punched him on the side. "But you have a panoramic window. Maybe you like it when someone watches over you?" She raised her eyebrows, nodding towards the window. "Of course, I love it. Pigeons, seagulls, butterflies," he nodded. "I just adore it." Bradley lived in a luxurious area in a 2-story apartment. His bedroom was large but furnished in the Spartan style. A huge bed, wardrobe and bedside tables. That was all the furniture. But the window was exquisite, covering the entire wall. Martha thought it must be remarkable here during the rain, although now the sun was shining brightly in the sky. "What time is it?" she asked. "I have to go to work." "But today is Sunday. Come up with another excuse to run away from me." The man smiled. "Oh, no. Of course. I only have to go to work tomorrow," Martha explained, rolling off the bed and looking for her clothes. "But I urgently need to finish one of my projects. The boss is coming tomorrow. You know, that nasty guy I told you about. I don't want to get fired so soon. I really like my job. Besides, I took vacation for a whole week, and he won't like that either. Probably he doesn't like anything except subordinates' tears." Grumbling about her boss, Martha began to gather her things. "I don't want to believe that your boss is such an unpleasant person," Bradley remarked, putting his hands behind his back. He watched Martha getting ready with pleasure. The girl shrugged, trying to put her hair in order with her hands. "I can't draw conclusions until I meet him in person," she reasonably noted, "but the rumours about this person do not presuppose too pleasant communication. I'm afraid of him in advance, you know. His name is Bradley Hayder. Have you heard of him by any chance? She turned around and saw that Bradley was almost choking on his restrained laughter. I know him, nodded Bradley. He threw off the blanket and smoothly, like a predator, began to approach the girl. She looked at him suspiciously and asked, Do you really know him? Bradley nodded affirmatively again and said, I know him very well, Ma. And now you too. Maybe now you can draw your own conclusions. It took some time for Martha to understand the meaning of Bradley's words. Then she gasped and retreated. No, no, exclaimed the girl, first turning pale, then blushing. Last night you only said yes and yes, Bradley noticed. I liked that more. Martha swallowed and covered her chest, although it was pointless. This is a nightmare, the girl muttered. I slept with my boss. Am I fired? Usually that's how promotions go, not dismissals, Bradley remarked. It was clear that the situation and Martha's reaction amused him. But Martha was in shock. This is not funny. She shook her head worriedly. Tell me you're joking. I can show you my passport. And I didn't hide where I work. I thought you understood. Bradley shrugged. Martha took a deep breath, then exhaled. Yesterday she was in a state of euphoria, and she didn't attach much importance to the fact that their line of work was so similar. She remembered how much she had told him about her colleagues and boss. Martha backed away towards the exit. Now I really have to go. We can have some breakfast. Then I could call you a taxi, Bradley said, no longer smiling but frowning. Listen, don't take everything so close to heart, okay? I liked you. I thought you liked me too. I'm not as stupid as they say, seriously. I'm just strict and take my work seriously. After all, I founded this company from scratch. It's unpleasant for me that some people treat my life's work so casually. It's a pity if they see it as some kind of aggression. Martha didn't hear his words any more. She nodded strangely, then turned on and hurried down. She found her dress next to the stairs. Martha, wait! The man tried to stop her, but the girl didn't want to wait. She hastily put on her dress, grabbed her shoes, and ran out of the apartment barefoot. She was ashamed, wildly ashamed. She devoted the rest of her weekend to remembering what she had talked about with Bradley. With horror, she realized that she had been too candid. On Monday, Martha came to work with her head down. She didn't finish the project, but she did bring a resignation letter. Why are you so gloomy? Did you see the boss already? Her colleague asked. Has he come already? Asked Martha. Yes, the very first one. He's sitting in the office, so angry. I haven't seen him so grim in a long time. Just like you. Martha nervously swallowed, tucking her dark locks behind her ears. She took a deep breath and headed towards Bradley's office. Knocking and hearing, "Come in," she walked inside. Bradley was sitting in the boss's chair, surrounded by morning light. Martha slid her gaze over the man, ignoring the butterflies in her stomach. "Bradley," Martha muttered, "I brought... well, here it is." She placed her resignation letter on her boss's desk. "What's this?" He looked at the paper with an unfriendly gaze. "My resignation. I can't work here anymore." "Are you a child, Martha?" Bradley said seriously. "Should I tear up this piece of paper, or will you take it down yourself?" At such impudence, Martha opened her mouth and looked at her boss. "Don't you let me quit?" "Are there any reasons?" He raised his eyebrows. "Besides me seeing you naked?" "Can we stop remembering that already?" Martha hissed, unexpectedly forgetting that she was shy. Bradley suddenly smiled and his gaze became warmer. "With that expression on your face, I like you more." He nodded approvingly and then took the letter, crumpled it up and threw it into the paper bin. Martha snorted, but then her shoulders drooped again. "Listen, that was a mistake. I can't work with you, and I'm uncertain if I want to spend time working right now," she said. "What do you mean?" The woman looked into his attentive grey eyes and decided to tell him the whole truth. She understood that after this he would turn away from her quickly, although maybe he would give her a bonus and some sympathy. "I don't have that much time left. That's what I mean. Understand, Bradley, it's not like that. I don't jump into bed with strangers. You caught me at a difficult moment." She tried to explain, sitting opposite her boss. "I'm sorry I didn't say it right away, but talking about how I only have a few days would ruin the vibe. I just wanted to relax, forget who I am, what's happening to me. Honestly, I was able to do this even for a short time. That's probably why the news that you're my boss knocked me off my feet. Fate seems to be laughing at me, constantly tripping me up. I did something that wasn't like me, and where did it lead? Even the man who I liked so much, whom I opened up to, turned out to be my boss. It's unfair." Bradley listened to her attentively, without interrupting, looking intently, as if he were peering into her soul. When Martha fell silent, he asked quietly, "So you really liked me, right?" "I didn't mean that." "Stop. What are you talking about? I told you that I'm dying and going through a divorce, and you only heard that." "You're still a narcissist," she said with a hint of irony. Bradley smiled. "I've heard that a girl who conquered me at first sight likes me, and then everything got shrouded in fog," he said, making Martha stare at her nails in embarrassment. "I don't understand. Are you kidding me?" The girl squinted as she looked into the man's face. She vividly remembered how her fiancé, with whom she had lived for so many years, ran away. So why was this completely unknown person to her so calm, as if he were a Chinese statue? Suddenly, Martha thought that this was the answer to her question. She meant nothing to him. For some reason, this thought pricked the girl in the heart with a sharp needle. It was unpleasant. Meanwhile, Bradley, who was sitting in front of the brunette, unaware of her thoughts, hurried to explain himself to her. "Martha, I will need time to digest all the information you just spilled on me," the boss honestly admitted. "However, I want to say again that none of your words convinced me to sign the resignation letter or forget that I had a good time with you. And also, didn't you say that you wanted to try something new for yourself? Step out of your comfort zone? How about having an affair with your boss?" Bradley playfully winked at her. Martha smiled shyly. Shaking her head, she slowly, as if reluctantly, looked away from the handsome man's face. She scanned the room where she had been for the first time. Several interesting and bright vintage posters with retro advertising hung on one of the walls, made of grey brick. In another corner, there was a shelf with a record player for vinyl records. The girl remembered that Bradley liked retro, loved history, and loved to travel. She thought she would like to get to know him better, and she still couldn't shake off the feeling that she'd known him for many years. There are such meetings, like with old and close friends, kindred spirits, who touch your heart at first glance and words. Bradley turned out to be one of those people. These thoughts simultaneously calmed and saddened the girl. She did not want to think about the future, tie her life to new relationships and feelings, because she already knew that a happy ending wouldn't be in her story. "I wouldn't want to start a relationship. Then, in the nightclub, I thought that I would run away from you in the morning, like Cinderella from The Prince," she confessed. "That it would be my daring adventure, a flash of passion with a stranger, like in the movies, and maybe revenge on my ex-husband, probably." "It's nice to hear that I've become an instrument of revenge," Bradley grumbled, but his eyes sparkled with mischief. "But then I suggest we be friends." The girl nodded hesitantly. "Well, it's decided. Bradley clapped his hands. "From now on, we are best friends." "Oh, just don't say that to my friend Catherine," Martha laughed. "She was in the club yesterday. She'd scratch your eyes out because she won't give up her status as my best friend to anyone." Bradley smiled softly at Martha, looking into her, and she realised that becoming friends with this man would be quite a challenge. "Then I start working?" she asked uncertainly. Bradley nodded, then added in a bossy tone, "I'm waiting for a project for a clothing brand from you, and please keep in mind we have lunch at my favourite cafe at 13 o'clock. I'll pick you up. Don't you mind?" Martha giggled, feeling like a young girl, and shook her head. "How can I say no to my scary boss?" she playfully asked, getting up from her seat. "I'll take away your bonus for saying no," he lazily threatened, returning to the papers he was working on before her arrival. Martha smiled widely and left the office. She leaned her back against the wooden door and closed her eyes, still smiling. Her heart was warm, and she felt a strange anticipation, like when she was a child on the eve of holidays. When a child falls asleep in nervous but pleasant excitement, waiting for magic and gifts under the tree from Santa Claus. Martha hadn't felt this pleasant feeling in a very long time. It disappeared from her life long before the doctors diagnosed her. She simply got bogged down in routine, like travellers get stuck in quicksand. Her relationship with Stephen had long lost its spark. He didn't try to please his wife. There were no surprises, no romance. It all seemed to have stayed in their early university years, and now was buried under the everyday life. That's why Martha's blood started to boil again. In her chest it felt like flowers were blooming, the first spring ones breaking through the frozen ground. It seemed to her that everything would be all right, at least for now. When the door closed behind Martha, Bradley's smile slowly faded from his face. He put the documents aside, put his elbows on the table, and buried his face in his hands, wiping away the accumulated fatigue. The insomnia of the last few days had taken its toll, and now there was Martha. He didn't remind the girl of what happened between them last night. No, not about bed scenes or hot whispers. Those moments were fresh in her memory. However, he realised that she had forgotten a lot. The thing is, before she fell asleep, Martha suddenly sobbed in his arms, small, fragile and naked, and shared her secret with him. The confession was almost the same as her story today in his office, but much more disjointed, emotional, and touching. That night she talked about how her husband treated her, what sentence the doctors gave her, and that she didn't want to live on pills, but wanted to breathe to the fullest until the last minute. He wiped away her tears when she confessed that she had never been to the countries she dreamed of. She said that she had dreamed of a cruise tour her whole life, wanted to see whales, dolphins, or anyone in their natural habitat. That night Bradley didn't fall asleep. He looked at Martha's face, illuminated by the moonlight, touched her soft hair scattered on his pillow, and thought. He thought about many things, and came to the conclusion that he didn't want to let her go, although his decision was extremely difficult for him. He lost his fiancée, who never became his wife, in a tragedy 3 years ago. However, he could not throw her out of his heart until now, so he was distracted by work, with such zeal and eagerness that he earned a reputation as an evil boss among his employees. He avoided relationships with other women and only had minor and short-lived intrigues in his life. That is until he met Martha, a girl so cute, sincere, insanely beautiful, and whose heart that had been broken so rudely. Bradley's agency was well known for its charity work, and he had always had a certain thirst to help people, which only grew stronger after the loss of his fiancée. But his desire to help Martha was deeper than philanthropy. Martha seemed to have settled in his heart back in the nightclub. With her delicate fingers She touched the strings of his soul that had long been silent, playing a melody and giving his heart a special rhythm. Bradley wanted to be close to her, feeling as if it were the right thing in the world, as if he had been waiting for this meeting with Martha. Bradley looked out the window at the grey sky with rare clouds. One of them looked like a hare with long ears, and the rest looked like sweet cotton candy. He drummed his fingers on the table, trying to calm down the excitement that had not left him in the whole day. He realized that he couldn't help Martha, but he wanted to try to make her last days beautiful, the way she dreamed. Bradley took his smartphone and, finding the necessary number in his notebook, pressed the call button. "Hello," he began softly. "I'm interested in cruise liners, and also, where in the world can we see whales?" The sky was grey and so low that it seemed it would fall into the water surrounding the cruise liner. Martha thought it reminded her of Bradley's eyes, the man who suddenly burst into her life at the most difficult time and then simply turned her world upside down. He became the artist who had many colours to paint her white, calm life. After that frank conversation, they really became friends, talked a lot, often walked, went to the movies and restaurants. Bradley often invited her home and cooked dinner himself. They talked about work and life, shared dreams and interests. Every morning, Martha eagerly waited just to see him, just to talk to him. She unexpectedly realized that every night, falling asleep, she thought about Bradley, and waking up, she also thought about him. After a month, Bradley brought Marina tickets for a cruise. Of course, she thought it was crazy to just take off in an unknown direction, to leave life and work behind. However, Catherine was very insistent. "It would be crazy not to do this. I'll break off our friendship if you refuse," she assured her friend. "You'll regret your whole life that you didn't dare. And besides, look how Bradley looks at you." "We decided to stay friends." Martha weakly and hesitantly waved off. Catherine snorted, rolling her beautiful eyes to the ceiling. "Oh, don't mess with me. There's always such tension between friends that it's scary to light a match. God forbid, everything will explode." "You're in love with each other, silly," she declared. "But I can't do that to him," Martha reminded Catherine. "He told me he had lost his fiancée. Do you want to lose another person?" Catherine's smile faded, but she quickly composed herself. Maybe she shouldn't decide for him what to do. Just open up to him, or at least meet him halfway. Then Catherine took the tickets for the cruise and waved them in Martha's face. "Start with this, okay?" Martha, who had dreamed of travelling with Bradley herself, quickly gave in. One day, the awaited miracle happened. "Whales!" someone shouted from those who were walking on the deck at that moment. "There are whales, and there are so many of them!" Passengers poured out onto the deck, staring wide-eyed at the vast waters. The water was filled with whales, up to the horizon. As the ship approached, the characteristic sounds of the whales expelled fountains of steam and water, surrounded the people from all sides. They were loud, unrelenting, and awe-inspiring. People tried to capture this wonderful moment on their cameras. Martha didn't try to reach for her phone in her pocket. She froze like a statue. It seemed that the girl even stopped breathing, and there was no question of blinking. Her heart was beating so fast that she had to press her hands to her chest. She was afraid that it would simply jump out, breaking her ribcage. A feeling of admiration made her lungs burst. Whales in the wild filled her with awe and delight. Bradley looked at the stunned Martha. The smile froze on his face. The corners of his lips trembled and slowly lowered. He noticed that Martha was crying. The girl realized this not immediately. Her vision simply became blurred. The picture became blurred. She blinked, trying to get rid of the unwanted tears so as not to miss a moment of this moment. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked worriedly. "Yes, Martha nodded, wiping away her tears with her fingers. I'm just too happy. I can't contain my emotions. There are so many of them inside me that I don't even understand what I'm feeling. My head is spinning with delight. Bradley put his hands on the rail and stood behind Martha, embracing her tenderly. She leaned her head on his shoulder, still gazing into the distance, and Bradley thought how pleasant it was to embrace this girl, as if she were his other half, a girl created for him. Thank you, the girl whispered, her voice trembling. You know, I love you. Something broke inside Bradley. She had not spoken these words before, nor had he. However, even the sight of a multitude of whales did not cause in Bradley the same trembling as Martha's words. I hope you're not saying this just because of your emotions, the man said unexpectedly seriously. Because I love you too, Martha. At night they were lying in their cabin. Bradley was already breathing evenly, falling asleep. Martha, however, couldn't close her eyes. Bradley, are you asleep? She asked quietly, not expecting an answer. However, the man responded. It all depends on you, princess, he mumbled sleepily, touching her hair with his lips. Your word and I'll be awake and cheerful. Just give me 5 minutes and a cup of coffee. Martha smiled. Bradley really treated her like a princess, protected her, tried to fulfill her wishes. I thought, she bit her lip, not daring to voice her thought. I thought that when we get back, I'll go to the doctor again. You know, it's strange, but I feel so good. Every day brings me happiness. I just don't believe in my illness. And if it really is killing me, then I just haven't seen enough of this world yet, and I want to live, she gasped, trying to cope with the enormous lump stuck in her throat. However, Bradley heard her and understood. The man's arms tightened around his beloved, pulling her closer. I didn't want you to bring up this topic, Martha, because it should be your choice, he began cautiously, but I've been thinking about it more and more. Let's try it. And you're not alone. I'll be there, no matter what happens. Martha's heart was relieved. She believed Bradley, and next to him, she could allow herself the daring, bold thought that everything would be okay. However, she didn't even imagine what awaited her. The black car stopped in the parking lot next to the clinic. Martha looked at the beautiful building, the windows of which reflected the sunlight. Last time she went to a different clinic, which didn't look as luxurious, but Bradley insisted on the best doctor in the city. Well, I'm off, the girl said cheerfully, and leaned forward to kiss him goodbye. Bradley accepted the kiss, but looked at her in surprise. Alone? No, I'll go with you. The man's voice sounded almost indignant. Bradley's whole appearance spoke that he was displeased at Martha's assumption that he would let her face her fate alone. But they won't let you into the office anyway, she shrugged, and you have things to do today. You'd think that there was something more important than your health, Martha. Let's go. If they don't let me in, I'll wait for you in the hall. Then we'll go have lunch or take a walk, okay? Bradley unbuckled his seatbelt and got out of the car. Martha froze in her seat. She still couldn't get used to such care, such sensitivity that this wonderful man gave her. Involuntarily, she compared Bradley and Stephen again, but remembered when she went to the clinic that fateful time, Stephen didn't even call her after seeing the doctor, although he knew that she had bad heredity and her poor health worried her. She remembered how she left the clinic and wandered alone in the city, and the rain drizzled from the sky. She remembered feeling empty, but couldn't find the strength to call anyone. Her phone remained silent until Catherine finished work and called her friend to find out how she went to the doctor. And Stephen didn't even call her after their breakup, just to find out if she was still alive. Martha only came to her senses when the window was knocked on, and then the car door opened. Bradley gallantly offered her his hand, smiling. "Please, lady." She smiled back at him, and when she placed her small palm in his hand, she felt a wave of relief. The fear of visiting the doctor began to leave her because she wasn't worried about anything with Bradley by her side. She was ready for any news. However, what the young people heard after the examination by the doctor plunged them into a state of shock. The man performed an ultrasound, looked at the results of the tests and research that the girl had previously taken. Then he looked at Martha with a strange expression on his face. "Excuse me, who told you it was time to look for a place in the cemetery?" the doctor asked. "Can I know the name of the hero?" Martha was confused by the question and the form in which it was asked. Yes, she had heard of medical humour, and a couple of times was even shocked by the jokes of surgeons and pathologists, but here she experienced an unpleasant feeling. Bradley didn't like the question either. He was sitting in the adjacent chair and leaned forward, intending to ask the doctor to choose his words carefully. However, Martha squeezed his fingers in time and blurted out, Dr. Martinson, I think something like that. The clinic is called Be Healthy. Why, what's the matter?" The doctor chuckled and shook his head, waving the papers. "Everything is much clearer now," he said, not hiding his amusement. Without explaining, he typed something on the laptop keyboard, then turned the screen towards Martha and Bradley. "Take a look at your doctor," he suggested, showing them an article from the local news portal. "Henry Martinson, a scam artist. The detainee is already serving his sentence. He took bribes, spun people around for useless treatment, frightening them with terrible fatal diagnoses. It's strange that this news passed you by. They showed it on all channels, talked about this fake doctor from every iron. But we weren't in town. We had a trip to watch whales," the girl muttered, confused. Her eyes scanned the article for details about the case. The photo did indeed show the same doctor that Martha had been seeing. "Wait," Bradley interjected with a tense voice. "What does all this mean for us? Did he lie to Martha? Am I understanding correctly that she's healthy?" Only at that moment did Martha realize where the doctor was leading them. She couldn't even think about such an outcome, and didn't allow anything similar to enter her head. Now she froze, her face flushing, her pulse pounding in her temples. The doctor nodded with satisfaction. "I won't even offer you any additional testing, Martha. You're perfectly healthy. Everything that the previous doctor told you was a lie. He only hoped that you would become one of his victims, that he would squeeze as much money out of you as possible. He acted according to an established scheme, working in collusion with other doctors who also received punishment. They did all the procedures in their clinic and then said that with great difficulty and God's help, they brought a person back from the other side. That's why his reputation was initially high. Fortunately, this story is over. It's good that you didn't agree to be treated by him." Martha looked away from the doctor's face, stared at the laptop, then at the table, but didn't see anything else in front of her. Her emotions were mixed up in her chest, pushing each other aside. Shock, amazement, joy, and fear that it was another mistake. Bradley lifted her hand and kissed the tips of her fingers, which brought her to her senses a little, and she finally realized that all of this was reality. "I love you," Bradley said, instead of all the other words of joy, regardless of the doctor's presence. "And I love you," Martha echoed, feeling tears welling up on her face once again. Looking into the face of her beloved, Martha inadvertently thought that her little failed death was worth it to meet her true love. Bradley proposed to Martha almost immediately after they found out the happy news, and at that moment the girl realized that she was still not divorced. Yes, she referred to Stephen as her ex-husband, and she hadn't seen him in a year. However, they were still officially together. Therefore, the girl quickly filed the necessary divorce papers. Later, Catherine joked that Martha had summoned her husband, like witches summon demons at seances. At first, Stephen appeared at the door of her apartment, but not finding the owner there, he went to the office. He was amazed to see Martha. She hadn't died, as he had thought. On the contrary, she had blossomed. Love and a wonderful vacation helped her become even more beautiful than she was before. Her eyes shone, her cheeks had a natural blush that was much prettier than any makeup. "Martha," Stephen muttered, looking around in surprise. "I received the divorce papers and came to talk." "You didn't have to bother, actually." Martha shook her head, not at all embarrassed by their meeting, as nothing stirred in her soul. "Now we can do everything online." Stephen hesitated, shifting his weight from one leg to the other. He looked around the office where Martha worked, then, once again with greed, stared at the girl. "This letter was a surprise to me," he admitted. "Really?" Martha raised her eyebrows. "It was a surprise to me that we didn't get divorced earlier. Now we'll have to wait until everything is legalized. It's strange that you didn't think about it, since you have new relationships and all that. How did Alethea tolerate that you have the wife? Or does she only like married men?" Martha leaned back in her chair and began playing with the pen, looking at Stephen. He looked pathetic at that moment. However, perhaps he had always been like that. Martha just didn't realize the flaws in people close to her. She didn't even notice his mistress. Stephen frowned and then confessed, "Not everything is going well with Alethea. I have problems with my business. That's why I came. How will we divide the property? I was hoping to mortgage the apartment, and—" Martha felt nauseous when she realized the hidden meaning behind his words. "Wait, Stephen." She stopped him, holding up her hands as if signaling to stop. "Do you mean you were waiting for me to leave this world and leave my apartment to you?" Stephen sulked at first, hunched his head, then remembered that he was still a man, and straightened up. "Don't you find this train of thought logical, Martha?" "Tell me about your plans," the girl unexpectedly asked, leaning forward and resting her chin on her crossed fingers. "I'm truly interested. Are you planning to sell the apartment and invest the money in business? Or are you going to live in it with your secretary, who was, according to you, just a friend?" "This is not funny." Stephen flared up, raising his voice. "You don't even know what I'm going through right now. I invested in the wrong thing, you understand? I listened to that idiot Alethea and hoped for a profit. Now I have a lot of debt and major tax problems. And Alethea, she ran away with a man as soon as the tax office knocked on my door, saying that my mess is not her business. Do you even understand how hard it is for me?" Martha remained expressionless, while her ex-husband shouted accusations and exclamations at her. She was surprised by her own reaction. It turned out that Bradley had taken up all the space in her heart and soul, leaving no feelings for Stephen, not even sympathy. Catherine would probably say that karma had caught up with him. Martha sighed and returned to her previous position. "Okay. In any case, please don't delay signing the divorce papers. This has already been dragged out too much. You'll get half of the acquired property. By the way, as far as I remember, the business created during the marriage is also divided equally. However, I don't want your debts, so you can keep your company. Consider it a gesture of goodwill," she said in a business-like tone, as if making a deal with a client. "But the apartment was inherited from my parents. It's not jointly acquired property, so don't count on it. Okay? Figure out how to deal with your problems on your own. I've been dragging you for too long." Stephen shook his head and leaned forward. "Are you serious, Martha? Why do you need the apartment? You don't have anyone else but me. We've been through so much together. Well, if you like." He nervously scanned her face. "Do you want me to come back to you? I'll take care of you until you die. You know, I realized how much I loved you when I was with Alethea. I made a mistake. This time, the feeling of nausea in Martha's throat became even more distinct. She narrowed her eyes, and her gaze grew severe. Unfortunately, I have bad news for you, Stephen, she said sharply. I'm going to live. I don't know for how long, maybe a year, maybe 10 years, or maybe I'll live to 100. What? What? Stephen stammered. But you said... Martha shrugged her shoulders, irritated, her brow furrowed. The doctor was a fraud. The story is long and I don't want to retell it. But wait, then we can fix everything, right? Stephen suddenly perked up. You and me, together, like old times. You always found a way to solve any problem, Martha. I really appreciated that. It will be problematic. Martha shook her head. My fiancé will be against it. Who? Stephen asked, staggering, as if someone had spit in his face. Martha turned the photo frame towards him. It was a picture of Bradley and Martha standing on the deck of a cruise ship. The ocean was burning silver in the distance, and whales were visible. That's why I'm asking you to hurry up, Martha calmly explained. We want to get married. To be honest, I completely forgot that I'm still married. I only remembered when Bradley proposed to me. Wait, you're joking, right? Stephen shook his head. You're teasing me. And where was that photo taken? And where was this photo taken? And did you find this Bradley somewhere? Wasn't that the name of your new boss? Martha smiled widely, nodding. It's nice to see you remember something about me. Yes, it's him. I met him not at work, but that's another long story, not for your ears. Stephen's face turned red, becoming the colour of a ripe tomato. You had an affair with your boss, he exclaimed, jumping to his feet. Martha unexpectedly burst out laughing. This coming from the man who left his wife for his secretary, she asked, as if she couldn't believe Stephen had brought up such a topic. You deceived me. Stephen shouted even louder. You said you were sick, that you had only half a year ahead of you. I didn't do it on purpose, Stephen. Martha waved her hands apologetically. Stephen shook with the news. He looked at the photo of the happy couple in bright life jackets. Martha was too beautiful at that moment, and she emitted some kind of power, self-confidence, which he had not noticed before. All of this made him terribly angry and annoyed. Meanwhile, Martha continued calmly, looking at her watch. You came to me at work, wasting time with useless conversations. We're getting divorced anyway. If you want a scandal, let's have one. I'm just not sure if you can handle another lawsuit, especially since you're already being followed by the tax authorities. As for the apartment you dreamed of, I don't live there anymore and have no intention of doing so. However, you won't get it, Stephen. I'm not a charity fund for cheating husbands. Stephen gritted his teeth with anger and leaned forward, resting his palms on the table. I see you grew your teeth in a year, became a bully like your arrogant girlfriend. Martha waited a second, then she too stood up from her seat and arrogantly looked at the man she loved, as if in a previous life. I've always had sharp teeth. I just didn't use them to sink into the throats of loved ones, unlike you. You didn't appreciate my loyalty, turned away from me at a hard time. You ran away, jumping into the first available bed. So you just can't come back into my life now and make any claims. You're pathetic and disgusting. Get out! Stephen jerked as if Martha had slapped him hard. His face was on fire, and his head felt like it was about to explode like a ripe watermelon. Without saying another word, Stephen turned and walked away. At that moment, the door opened and Bradley appeared on the threshold. He looked at his fiancée's guest with a surprised look, but quickly recognized his face, even though it was contorted with anger. "Stephen, right?" the man asked, trying to hide the disdain he felt towards this person. "I won't shake your hand. Did you come to sign divorce papers?" Stephen glanced at Bradley with a fleeting, angry look. "The groom himself? Well, congratulations. I wish you both happiness. Just tell me, what's it like to pick up someone else's woman, so to speak, to eat someone's leftovers?" he asked with a venomous tone. "I have no idea," Bradley replied calmly. "I've never had affairs with other men's women. When Martha and I met, she was single. They say some scoundrel dumped her when he found out she was sick. There are such moral freaks, right?" Bradley winked at the pale Stephen, but a moment later his feigned cheerfulness and calmness disappeared from his face. "And now, I advise you to leave the room before my patience runs out. Believe me, I'm trying very hard not to throw you out." Stephen felt through his skin that the man was not joking. He silently retreated and left the room sideways. Martha approached Bradley, hugging him around the waist. "Sorry for this. I didn't know he would come here," she said shyly. "What an unpleasant guy. And how did you live with him?" "I'm itching to hit him," Bradley said discontentedly. "Maybe I should catch up with him." "Don't bother, dear." Martha shook her head, leaning towards her man. He kissed her on the forehead, hugging her around the waist. "By the way, that's why I came. We got a response from the jewellery brand. They want the full package of services. You're a genius." He praised his most valuable employee. "I'm lucky to have you in every way. It's a good thing I threw away your resignation letter." Martha smiled widely, looking at her future husband, whom she loved with all her heart, and, moreover, knew that it was mutual. Over the past year, she had realized something else important. After a while, it might turn out that the streak of life that seemed black was actually an airstrip. Martha really took off and didn't intend to stop for a moment in the huge flow of happiness.
Brittany knocked on her neighbour's door. Brooke opened it and stared at her classmate in surprise. "Do you have anything to eat?" asked Brittany as she entered the room. "Yes, come in," Brooke offered. They sat at the table, which served as both a lunch and writing table, and Brittany began to eat pasta, telling Brooke about her unsuccessful date. Brittany was a beautiful girl, and there were always guys who wanted to meet her and spend time with her. However, Brittany dreamed of fancy restaurants, expensive cars, and a romantic marriage proposal. Lately, she started to meet men online, going on dates almost every evening, but no one was suitable for her. Even today, she had dated a miser who took her to a cheap diner, from which she ran away as soon as she realized that there was nothing more to expect. The day before yesterday, on the contrary, a rich and generous man had come to the date, but by the end of the evening he concluded that he and Brittany were not suitable for each other. Imagine, he dragged me to a Chinese porcelain exhibition. We walked and looked at vases and plates. He told me something about emperors of the dinosaur era and other nonsense. Boring. Then he took me to the cinema, to some art house. Why am I so unlucky with men, huh? Don't worry, you'll find someone else, Brooke said uncertainly. Brittany sighed and went to sleep in her room. She had to go to college the next day. The professor looked at Brittany hostilely, as if she were to blame for his own unattractiveness, weight, and probable loneliness. "You have serious problems with your academic performance. Very serious," he said. "I'm trying my best." Brittany made honest eyes and nodded frequently in confirmation of her words. I, personally, don't see that you're trying. You're skipping lectures. You probably have more important things to do than studying." He got up with difficulty and approached the girl almost closely. His eyes slid over her face and settled lower on the neckline of her blouse. "Maybe we can come up with something." Brittany exhaled feverishly, thinking about what to do. The prospect of being expelled did not please her. Studying seemed to be the only way to catch on in the city and somehow arrange her life, especially since she did not know what to tell her parents. And soon it would be summer. She was supposed to go home to the village and talk about her academic achievements, but she had none. "You could, for example, start attending lectures," the professor suggested, shrugging. "But I'm afraid in your case it's already pointless. I'll have to bring up the issue of your expulsion." "Can't we come to some kind of agreement?" Brittany asked flirtatiously, leaning forward slightly and showing off her cleavage to the professor. She knew her worth: beautiful, tall, modern, and moderately uninhibited. She had long suspected that the old professor had his eye on her, and judging by his reaction, she was right. "May I invite you somewhere?" the professor asked, blushing. "I agree, and completely trust your taste," Brittany breathed out, smiling encouragingly. That was enough to make the man bloom. He bowed his head, revealing his shiny bald head surrounded by rare hair, and kissed her hand. Neither Brittany nor the professor suspected that two students were standing outside the door, greedily eavesdropping on their conversation. When Brittany left the classroom, they quickly moved away from the door and went straight to the rector's office. There, they spoke with the vice-rector, who happened to be the wife of the amorous professor. In the evening, Brittany and the professor went to a restaurant and then to his house. The man was sure that his wife wouldn't be home for at least another 3 hours, but unexpectedly the door to the bedroom opened and his wife appeared in the doorway. There was a scandal, shouting and tears. The professor, looking confused, ran around the room picking up his clothes. Brittany sat on the big bed and watched this scene in horror. The wife looked at her husband with hatred and pity. "We've been together for 30 years. Our children have grown up. You already have 2 grandchildren, and you still continue to cheat on me," she said bitterly. "Do I need to remind you who you owe everything you have now to?" She waved her hand in despair and looked at Brittany angrily. "And you're expelled." The verdict was announced. 2 weeks passed. Brittany had been shaking on an old bus for 2 hours now. Her neighbour, a perky elderly woman, had been telling the village news the whole time. Brittany looked out the window. She already regretted accepting her friend's offer to spend the summer at her country house. But it was impossible to go home. She couldn't imagine how she would face her parents. So she called and lied, saying that she had passed her exams successfully and decided to stay in the city for the holidays. And now, on the bus, she was wondering if she had done the right thing. But what other options did she have? Renting an apartment in the city was expensive, while the house in the village was free. The bus turned off the road and stopped. An elderly lady pulled some baskets into the aisle, then turned to Brittany and said, "My relative Anthony should be here to meet you. You're new here, so we can give you a ride." Brittany got off the bus, took out her fashionable suitcase and looked around. People were dispersing in different directions, and the elderly woman was already hurrying towards an old pickup truck.
Anthony seemed very attractive to Brittany. He was around 40 years old, tall with neatly combed light hair and grey eyes. "So, Auntie, did you visit your grandchildren?" he asked, opening the trunk. "Of course," the elderly woman replied playfully. "I saw my grandchildren and the city." "That's good." The man nodded approvingly and looked at the pretty stranger with chestnut curls and green eyes. "Hello, who are you going to visit in that backwoods?" "I came to your area to rest," Brittany replied thoughtfully. "Well, there's nothing to see here," Anthony laughed. His laughter was infectious. Brittany smiled. "I am quite satisfied with the river, fresh air. The nature here is beautiful." The man agreed. When he learned that Brittany was going to live in the Blakes' old house, he was very surprised. The house had long been uninhabitable. Brittany shrugged helplessly. "Well, I'll manage somehow," she said uncertainly. "I was told there are tools in the barn." Anthony shook his head, loaded her suitcase into the trunk, then opened the back door. "Get in. We'll figure out the house somehow." Chloe kneaded dough with a smile, stealing glances at her quiet children who were building something with Legos on the floor, frowning in concentration. Although Chloe couldn't give birth, she loved her children like they were her own. She and her husband had adopted the boy and the girl from an orphanage when they were 5 and 3 years old, respectively. Before that, they had tried everything to have their own child, from seeing doctors to visiting shamans and psychics, but to no avail. They gave up hope and even considered divorce, with Chloe suggesting that her husband leave her so as not to ruin the life of a healthy man who wanted a family. But he stayed, reasoning that if it wasn't meant to be, they would live together no matter what. And then the idea of adoption was born. Chloe baked a pie and meticulously cleaned the house. Despite being a city girl and the daughter of wealthy parents, she was very house-proud. They had moved to the countryside 3 years ago, and in that time, Chloe fully adapted to rural life. She learned to bake pies, milk goats, feed chickens, and more, without which one simply cannot survive in the village. Suddenly the dog barked happily. Anthony had finally arrived. A minute later, her husband appeared in the house. He hung up his jacket, walked up to the mirror, and scrutinized his reflection. Chloe was surprised. Anthony had never paid much attention to his appearance before. "You're a bit late," she said, looking at the clock. "It's already 7:30. "Well, a girl from the city came here," Anthony shrugged. "Henry Blake's granddaughter rented her out the house for the summer. I gave her and my auntie a lift from the bus stop and helped a little," he replied without looking at his wife. "No one's lived in the house for a while. Even the windows were boarded up." "She came alone, didn't she?" Chloe asked, wiping her hands with a towel. "Yes, she's a student," Anthony answered indifferently. "That's strange," Chloe shrugged. "Well, let's eat. Sit down." Anthony quickly washed his hands and sat down at the table. He threw the towel aside and breathed in the aroma of freshly baked cabbage pie. "You're so skilled a hostess," he said, hugging his wife with pleasure. The next day, Anthony came to help Brittany again. He fixed the table and stool and hung a hammock in the yard. "I don't know how to thank you," Brittany said playfully. "We, the villagers, are simple. Thanks is enough," said Anthony. "But you don't seem like a villager," replied Brittany. Anthony laughed and sat on a repaired stool. "You're right. I moved here from the city with my wife and children." Brittany tried her best to hide her disappointment at the news that her interlocutor was married. "It would be interesting to hear how you ended up here," she said. Anthony shrugged.
I used to come here every summer to my grandmother. Once, an expensive car drove up to our neighbour's house and a woman, a man and a little girl got out. They went inside the house. Then the local boys approached me and said, "Hey, this is our street. Get out of here." I grabbed a stone and said, "If you don't leave me alone, you'll get it." And I threw the stone at them. I wanted only to scare them, but I hit the car. The glass shattered. The boys ran away immediately, and I stood there in shock, like a statue. Then the door of the house opened, and the same girl came out. She looked at the car and asked, "Did you break it?" I nodded. Then her father came out of the house, looked at me, looked at the car and started yelling. But the girl turned to him and calmly said that she accidentally broke it. She said a big dog was running around. She got scared and threw a stone. Her father looked at her affectionately, patted her on the head, apologized to me and went back into the house. I started courting of that girl. I left wild flowers under her gate every day. One day I even caught fish in the river and left it on their threshold. Her father, I remember, threw away the fish and scolded. "What kind of joke is that in the village?" And then I decided to write her a love letter. I put it in the mailbox. Her mother took the letter out, but didn't tear it up, and gave it to her daughter. How romantic! Brittany clapped her hands. And then? Then I got many bad grades in school and didn't come back to the village anymore. I stayed at home and studied during the summer. Later I came to my grandmother's house again, but I didn't see the girl anymore. Years passed. I joined the army, and in the second year of service, I received a letter from my mother that my grandmother had died. At the funeral, a beautiful girl approached me. I looked at her, and it was the same girl. She had grown up, become more beautiful. In short, I fell in love again, but this time seriously. I had 1 day left before I returned to the army, and I spent it with her. We talked, sat by the river, remembered our childhood, the fish and the broken car, and my love letter. Anyway, she said she would wait for me to finish my service. And did she? Brittany gasped. Yes. I finished my service, we got married, and then we adopted children and moved here. Oh, really? You adopted kids? You're a saint, exclaimed Brittany. Anthony smiled shyly. Oh, come on. I just always wanted children, and she... He hesitated. Brittany nodded understandingly. That's personal, I understand everything. Anthony left with a strange feeling of shame and awkwardness. He was ashamed that he unintentionally compared this charming guest to his wife, and awkward because the comparison was not in his wife's favour. Brittany was lost in thought, sitting in her bedroom in the evening. The fact that the handsome Anthony was married and had 2 children was somewhat upsetting. As she was putting on her pyjamas, she caught some movement out of the corner of her eye. "Who's there? Come out and show yourself." There were sounds of rustling, then silence. Brittany felt uneasy. 10 minutes later, Brittany was trying to fix a hole in the fence when Anthony caught her at this activity. "What are you doing?" he asked in surprise. "I'm repairing the fence," Brittany answered a little irritably. "Can you help?" Anthony walked into the yard and agreed to help with fixing the fence. Brittany briefly recounted what had happened, and Anthony laughed, good-natured. "Your neighbour, old Tom, hasn't been interested in anything like that for a long time. He's beyond suspicion." Brittany protested, insisting that she had heard someone rustling around. Anthony walked up to the fence and leaned into the gap, beckoning Brittany over with his hand. "Do you see him? That's who was rustling," he said, pointing to a dog. Brittany laughed.
Realizing her mistake, Anthony decided to nail up the gaps anyway for Brittany's peace of mind. She was grateful, and 5 minutes later, Anthony was already hammering away, attaching pine slats to the largest gaps. He felt Brittany's gaze on his back and compared her to his wife once again, and once again, not in his wife's favour. Meanwhile, his friend Jack was looking for him. "And where is Anthony?" Jack asked as he entered the house. "At work. Where else would he be?" Chloe replied, surprised, as she set aside her knitting needles and yarn. "Don't you work together? Why all the questions?" Jack scratched his balding head, looking puzzled. "He's not there. I've been looking for him all day. I need permission to get the parts, but I can't reach him." Jack said his goodbyes, hopped on his motorcycle and leisurely drove down the street, turning his head, searching for the familiar blue pickup. Soon he spotted the car parked at the gate of an old uninhabitable house. But the house no longer looked abandoned. The windows were open, women's clothes hung on a line in the yard, and the door was ajar. Jack got off his motorcycle and knocked on the door. Voices and hurried footsteps could be heard inside the house. Anthony opened the door, looking peculiar, dishevelled, shirtless, and with his belt undone. In general, everything became clear without words. Jack was Anthony's friend, but as an exemplary family man, he did not welcome such frivolity. "I need to sign some papers," Jack said, flustered. "I'm going to get the parts. I've been looking for you all over the workshop, and I couldn't reach you." "Do you have the papers with you?" Anthony asked irritably. Jack pulled out a folder from his backpack and handed it to Anthony. Without looking, Anthony signed the papers with a flourish. "What are you doing here?" Jack asked. "None of your business." Anthony sternly looked at his friends. "You didn't see anything. Got it?" Jack nodded uncertainly. Anthony reached out his hand and squeezed it tightly, looking meaningfully into his eyes. "Just don't ask about anything, okay? I haven't figured out how it happened yet." Jack had no intention of asking about anything. He felt sorry for Chloe and her 2 young children. He also felt disappointed in his friend, and that hurt the most. Days went by, and Anthony's behaviour became increasingly strange with each passing day. He came home late, ate quickly and silently, answered all questions monosyllabically or with standard phrases. Chloe couldn't shake a nasty, unexplained feeling and imagined the worst scenarios. She wanted to believe Anthony, but it only got worse. Chloe didn't even notice when Susan, Jack's wife, and her friend came into the house. Susan was working at the library. She was very well read and proudly considered herself part of the village's intellectual elite. "Hi," she cheerfully greeted Chloe. "You look like you're going to the conference. What are you thinking about?" "About trust. How do you think? If a man loves, he'll deceive?" Chloe answered a question with a question. Love is often elevated to some absurd level in books, but even love is not a panacea for deceit. It's a well-known fact that people lie. Those who are honest towards some people can be very calculating and cunning towards others. Such is the paradox, my friend. Someone deceives under pressure of circumstances, someone for a mere ego boost, and someone simply cannot imagine their existence without lies. But not trusting anyone means being in constant stress, looking for hidden meanings everywhere, exhausting oneself and others with doubts. You cannot to love, but if you don't trust, why bother starting a relationship at all? Susan expounded. Chloe sighed. Susan's musing added to her confusion. Perhaps she needed to act simply, talk to her husband heart to heart, and then see what would happen. However, the conversation did not take place. It so happened that Chloe found out about her husband's infidelity, seeing everything with her own eyes. After talking a little more with her friend, Chloe saw her off and, looking at the clock again, dialed her husband's number. He was unavailable again. Without thinking for long, she left the house and walked down the street. People were walking towards her, some from the farm, some from the sawmill, and some from the machine shop. Chloe saw Jack. "Hi, do you know where Anthony is?" she asked him. "How would I know?" Jack became nervous and looked away. "Am I his supervisor?" "Don't be so foggy," Chloe questioned. "I can see that you're hiding something." "I'm tired. I'm going home." Jack turned away quickly and hurried down the street. Chloe watched him for a long time and went towards the river, where the Blakes' house was located. Approaching, she saw her husband's car at the beginning of the twilight and the light in the house. No longer hoping to see anything good, she looked into the windows. Her husband was embracing and kissing a young stranger who was practically without clothes. Chloe felt as if someone was choking her, but she managed to control herself, opened the door and entered the house. Seeing her, Anthony froze, and Chloe looked at him disdainfully and left the house. The woman practically ran down the street, trying with all her might not to cry. The sound of an engine was heard behind her. "Chloe, wait! Listen!" Anthony leaned out of the car window. He looked pitiful. His hair was dishevelled and his eyes were frightened. "Wait, let me explain." Chloe stopped, turned to him and crossed her arms over her chest. "Explain?" She squinted. "Well, try to explain." "I don't even know how it happened," he mumbled. "I lost my mind, made a mistake. It happens. Please forgive me." Chloe really wanted to hit him. She probably would have done it if there weren't people on the road who threw curious glances at them. "Let's talk at home," she said shortly and walked down the road. Anthony slowly followed. "Get in the car," he asked. "It looks strange. I'm driving, you're walking. Think about what people will say." "Is that all you care about?" Chloe replied bitterly. They covered the entire path home the same way. She was on foot, he was driving. At home, Chloe sat on the sofa and then quietly cried. She didn't throw stools at him or smash plates, but these quiet tears of his wife were more frightening to him than any screams and scandals. "Let's forget about this," he asked again. "Do you want me to go to her right now and tell her that there's nothing between us? Do you want that? I love only you." "Yes, I want. I want you to pack your things and leave." She sobbed. "I'm not interested in where you go, to her or anyone else." "I won't pack anything," he frowned. "Then I'll help you," Chloe shrugged, opened the closet door, and within 5 minutes, Anthony's suitcase was filled with his clothes. "Take your things and leave," she said firmly. Anthony walked out of the house with his head down. He drove to the end of the street, stopped at Jack's house and honked. His friend came out immediately as if waiting. He looked at the suitcase on the back seat and sighed sympathetically. "She kicked you out?" Anthony nodded and pulled out cigarettes, handing one to his friend. They smoked in silence. "Well, I was thinking," Anthony finally said. "Starting tomorrow, I'm going on vacation. You stay for me. I'll go to the sea with Brittany. She's never been there before and I need to rest." "Get a grip," Jack protested. "Your family is falling apart.
and you're going to resorts with your mistress. What's wrong with you?" "It's none of your business. You better keep an eye on things here while I'm gone." Anthony threw away the cigarette, started the car, and drove to Brittany. Jack shook his head and walked home, inwardly shuddering at his friend's actions. The next day, Anthony grabbed his mistress and took her to the sea to relax and get revenge, while his faithful wife was left alone with the 2 children. 10 days later, in the village, Jack enthusiastically hugged his brother. "Hey, bro!" He slapped Charles on the shoulders. "How long has it been since we've seen each other?" "Couple of years, probably," Charles smiled. Jack looked at his cousin's shiny car. "Cool car," he said admiringly, touching the shiny wing of the black BMW. "Thanks," Charles replied modestly. "Business is going well. I can afford it." "Good for you," Jack said, and pointed to his Ford, which had seen better days. "And I'm still on the same old horse." "Not bad either." Charles touched the worn handles. Susan clapped her hands. "Oh, men will be always men, ready to talk about cars only. Charles, come in. We don't promise museums and restaurants here, of course, but we guarantee good fishing and a warm welcome." The men obediently entered the house while Susan quickly set the table. Out of courtesy, she sat with the men for half an hour before heading to her friend's house to discuss her husband's brother, whom she believed to be a very worthy man. At Chloe's, Susan sat in the kitchen and vividly described the guest, sharing everything she had learned from him and from her husband. "He's a good person, but unlucky in his personal life," she said in the end. "Unlucky?" Chloe asked indifferently. Despite Susan's efforts, the suitor's candidacy failed to impress Chloe. She listened half-heartedly. Her thoughts were elsewhere. "When he shared his last love, I felt so sorry for him. Although with his money, he could buy anyone." "You can't buy love," Chloe sighed. "That's true too," Susan agreed with a sigh. "Do you want to meet him?" Chloe laughed. "What's so funny?" Susan didn't understand. "Even if I wanted to, how can I compete with the city beauties? Besides, I have 2 children." "But he said he always dreamed of a normal family, but fell in love with this Helen, who turned out to be a cuckoo. She left her own child with her mother and went to the capital to build her own personal life." "Yes, it's a pity, of course," sincerely sympathized Chloe. Chloe had changed a lot over the last few days, as if years had passed. Outwardly, she remained just as attractive, but the spark of someone interested in life had disappeared from her eyes. She kept the house clean, the children were well groomed and fed. She did not forget about herself either. She did not get ungroomed and did not gain extra pounds. She did not eat sweets to her resentment. She understood she was responsible for her 2 young children, who were certainly not to blame that their foster father had betrayed them and decided to go out on the side. Initially, she waited for Anthony to return and was even ready to forgive him on the condition that the mistress would leave and he would forget her forever. But Anthony didn't come back, and it turned out that he was now at the seaside with his mistress. So, Chloe waved off persistent invitations from her friend, saying, "I'm not up for new acquaintances right now." Meanwhile, Charles and Jack were riding a motorcycle through the streets, laughing. The villagers looked at them with either a smile or disapproval. "Charles, where are you going?" Jack yelled, pointing forward. Charles turned the handlebars, but it was too late. The front wheels sank into the brownish-green slush. The motorcycle tipped over,
and both of them fell to the puddle. "Where did you learn to drive?" Jack shouted. "It was my first time on a motorcycle," Charles excused himself. "What's going on here?" a stern female voice asked. The men turned and saw Susan standing with her hands on her hips, glaring at them. "Darling, don't be mad. We were just taking a little ride." "I see you're drunk," his wife retorted. "Just a little bit," replied Jack. Charles remained silent. He wasn't looking at Susan, but rather the woman standing behind her, graceful, thin, with a tired look in her brown eyes. Susan turned to her, said reproachfully, "Meet Chloe. This is Charles, the brother of my alcoholic. And apparently he's an alcoholic too." "Hello." Charles stood up and shook off his expensive jeans. "You'll excuse us. We've been making some noise. Just haven't seen my brother for a long time." Chloe smiled sadly and pulled out a handkerchief, applying it to his forehead. "You're hurt. Come inside, I'll treat your wound." Jack smiled and showed his scraped elbow. "I'm hurt too. I need treatment too." "I'll treat you in such a way at home that you'll remember it for life. Come on, get your bike and let's get home," Susan promised her husband, pretending to be angry. Charles and Chloe watched as the roaring motorcycle carried the couple up the street. "Come on." Chloe opened the gate. In the house, she took out gauze and peroxide, quickly treating the scrape. The entire time, Charles watched her silently, seeming to admire her. "You have such soft hands," he noted. Chloe blushed. Susan was right, this Charles was undoubtedly attractive, and he did have a sad look in his eyes. "They're just hands," she answered impassively, putting a band-aid on the wound. "There, all done." "Thank you." He touched the thick strip on his forehead. "Do you live alone?" "With my children. They're at a friend's house right now." "And your husband?" "I don't have a husband." She paused. "I don't have a husband anymore." "Did you get divorced?" Chloe looked into his eyes intently. "Charles, it's time for you to go. I have a lot to do." Charles nodded in agreement. "Yes, sorry for the inappropriate questions. I was just curious. Thank you for treating my wound." Later that evening, Charles asked Jack to tell him about Chloe. In general, Anthony went to the sea with his mistress. Jack finished his story. Charles shook his head. "Oh, and I asked her about her husband. What a fool I am," he said regretfully. "Don't worry, you didn't know," his cousin reassured him. "So, did you like her?" Charles nodded. "Listen, but there's one important thing," Jack reluctantly said. "She has 2 adopted children." "I don't see any problem." "And that's wonderful," Charles thoughtfully replied. "Another plus for her. If she has adopted kids, that means she has a kind heart." Jack glanced at his wife, who only smiled at the corners of her mouth. The next morning, Charles woke up early and went to the nearest town. He bought a gorgeous bouquet of red roses, Belgian chocolates, and French champagne. An hour later, Charles was already standing at Chloe's door, politely knocking. 2 children came out of the house and stared at the guest curiously. "Who are you?" "Me?" Charles winked and handed them a box of candies. "I'm here for your mother. Is she home?" The children grabbed the box and ran into the house. A few seconds later, Chloe appeared in the doorway. Seeing the guest, she involuntarily adjusted her hair and pulled down her long skirt. "Hello, Chloe." Charles politely bowed his head. "I hope you're not too busy." "Are you here for something?" she asked. Charles shrugged. "I'm just here for you." Meanwhile, Anthony quickly realized that something was wrong with his new passion. As soon as they settled into the hotel, Brittany, a frivolous beauty, turned into a disgusting shrew right before his eyes. She behaved as if she were a lady that everyone owed something to. She grumpily argued with the administration because she did not get a room with a sea view, although Anthony had paid for a room without a sea view. She demonstratively pulled the curtains and constantly nagged Anthony that he could have found better vacation conditions. Then Brittany complained about the noise allegedly coming from the broken air conditioner in the room. She started walking around the neighbouring rooms to check how loud it was for them. The guests complained about the rude neighbour, and the administration asked her to stop these antics. Instead of relaxing and enjoying herself, she decided to fight to the end and complained to the administrator about the cynical and unprofessional treatment she received. She screamed at the maids, complained that they were rude to her, contemptuously called the beach a dirty dump and the sea a stinky puddle. In addition, she poisoned herself with something in the hotel restaurant and spent 2 days in the room hugging the toilet. But on Anthony's advice to visit a doctor, she disdainfully replied to that she trusted local doctors even less than local chefs. Anthony couldn't help but feel like he was going crazy watching all of this. And for this woman, he traded his Chloe. He already knew that this was their first and last vacation together. Anthony was tired of feeling embarrassed by his companion, so he abruptly set a condition that either she calmly rests and is content with what she has, or he leaves. After these words, Brittany was offended and left the hotel. Anthony searched for her all night throughout the city and eventually found her drunk at a roadside cafe in the company of drunken men. Upon demanding that she go with him to the hotel, she brazenly smiled and sent him away. When the conversation became heated, her companions intervened. Anthony returned to the hotel alone. He gathered his things and went to the airport. His mood was terrible. He regretted meeting Brittany and cursed her for being so frivolous and himself for giving in to weakness. Now he had one task: to beg for forgiveness from his wife. He had no doubt that he would succeed. After landing, Anthony left the airport building, took the truck from the parking lot and drove home. Passing through a small town, Anthony belatedly remembered that it would be more convenient to ask for forgiveness with gifts. But he was so angry with Brittany that he didn't even think of getting presents for his wife and children. Therefore, he went into the first store he found and bought the most expensive champagne and the most expensive box of chocolates. The seller was surprised and put the box and bottle in front of him. "Strange, you're the second one buying this today," she said. "And who was the first?" Anthony asked, paying. "I don't know. A handsome man in a black BMW with out-of-state plates." Approaching the house, Anthony saw a black BMW parked in front of it. Stopping next to it, he got out of the car and looked at the sparkling crossover. "Strange," he muttered and pushed the gate, holding the champagne and chocolates to his chest. Upon entering the yard, he immediately heard his wife's ringing laughter and the rolling laughter of an unfamiliar man. Anthony stood in bewilderment, then still went into the house. The guest was sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea. Opposite him was Chloe. At the sight of the person entering, both of them stopped smiling. "How should I interpret this?" he growled, looking straight at his wife, and sat down on a chair, making it clear who the master of the house was. "I don't have to answer to you," she answered calmly. "Do you think you have the right to ask me such questions after everything you've done?" Anthony had nothing to say to this argument, so he frowned and stared fiercely at the guest. Charles looked unperturbed. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" Anthony snarled. "Do you know she's my wife?" "I've never seen you before," Charles replied mockingly. "How should I know?" The atmosphere in the house was tense. Chloe stood up from her chair and positioned herself between the two men. "You see, very soon I will no longer be your wife," she calmly addressed her husband. "We are getting a divorce. I hope you won't object." "I am objecting. We'll see about that." Anthony shouted menacingly and threw champagne and candies on the floor. Chloe narrowed her eyes. "Was it me who took a mistress and ran off with her to the seas?" "And you're glad that I have done so?" snarled Anthony. "Now I am," Chloe shouted, "very happy, and it would be nice if you just left now." Charles felt uncomfortable. He wasn't afraid of Anthony's sudden return. He just felt awkward being a witness to a family scene. "Anthony, can I talk to you?" he said. "Let's go outside and talk like men." Anthony responded with such a selection of curses that Chloe had to push him out of the house. Spewing curses, he sat in the car and drove off. Charles looked seriously at Chloe. "Are you serious about divorcing him?" "Absolutely, Charles," she answered quietly and looked at him in surprise. "I'm glad." He approached her, took her hand, which smelled of lavender soap, and kissed it. The woman was embarrassed and quickly withdrew her hand. "Charles, you've only known me for a short time." "I've met many women, and I always thought I was in love, but then I saw you and realized that there was no love there. I was wrong, confusing this feeling with passion, infatuation, anything. And now I met you and realized that I love you." Later, when he left, Chloe was washing the dishes with a smile, reminiscing about her childhood in the village, where her parents took her almost every summer. She remembered how she secretly watched a boy who used to leave flowers under the gate and then ran away without looking back. She remembered the letter in which the boy confessed his love to her. Chloe turned off the water, quickly wiped her hands and went to her bedroom. Digging through her old things, she pulled out a yellowed envelope, read the almost forgotten lines, pressed the letter to her chest, and burst into tears. Honestly, she still missed Anthony very much, but he betrayed her, so she would try to forget about him. Such things are unforgivable. And Charles, it seemed to her that he was sincere in his feelings. After all, sometimes people fall in love at first sight. As for her feelings, time will tell. 3 months later, an ordinary-looking family strolled along the main street of the capital. A father, mother, and 2 children. The kids gazed around in wonder as if everything around them was a fairy tale. Charles and Chloe smiled as they watched them and kept silent, not because they had nothing to say to each other, but because they found it pleasant to walk side by side and be silent. "How about trying the status of a married woman again?" Charles finally broke the silence. "I haven't recovered from the divorce yet," Chloe replied with a smile. "I still hear the curses ringing in my ears." Anthony was not going to give up without a fight. He came back again and again, begged, pleaded, threatened, and even tried to blackmail her with the children. The more he came back, the more he began to annoy her. The woman saw neither pride nor repentance in his behaviour. By then, Charles had returned to his city and regularly called to Chloe before coming to the village again and having a serious talk with Anthony. No, he didn't threaten him. He simply offered a large sum of money. Anthony was first offended, then pondered, and then became even more audacious and demanded that they give him the house in exchange for agreeing to the divorce. Charles suggested it to Chloe to move in with him in his big apartment in the city and give the house to her husband. She agreed, especially since there was nothing left for her in the village. After the deal, Anthony and Chloe quickly divorced. The woman knew nothing about the fate of his mistress. Anthony simply said they had broken up. One day, Mrs. Blake, the owner of the house where Brittany had been staying, came to visit. She said that Brittany had returned to her native village and got a job at a poultry farm. None of her bright plans came to fruition. No marriage, no education, no money. Now Chloe is trying to come to terms with the fact that she has been living with a mercenary man who was not only unfaithful, but also vile. She didn't want to hear anything more about him, and for the first time in a long time, she thanked fate that the children were adopted. Forget about him. You left the house. Let him live as he wants, and you're here with me, and the children too, said Charles. She nodded and smiled, and the autumn sky smiled too. A second ago, gloomy and unfriendly, the sun peeked out from behind leaden clouds, reflected off the wet cobblestones, played in the windows with golden flashes, ran across the reliefs of the buildings, and illuminated the square. Chloe suddenly felt bright and happy. The clouds disappeared in her soul too, and the long-awaited sun looked out. Oliver quietly put his heavy travelling bag by the door. Wanting to surprise his wife, he returned home without warning after working on the oil rig for 2 months. Before meeting his wife, whom he had not seen for so long, he bought her favourite white roses and excitedly anticipated walking into the house and surprising her with his sudden return. Oliver quietly took off his jacket in the hallway as suddenly he heard his mother-in-law's voice coming from the kitchen. "I have told you before that you deserve more. It's time to say goodbye and put an end to this. You've suffered long enough with him. That's enough already. You have finally made the right decision. Let him look for a fool who will keep quiet. Believe my experience in life. Either you will make up your mind or you will continue to suffer." Oliver was shocked by what he had heard. It seemed to him that the ground had slipped from under his feet at the moment when his wife's mother Miranda said that Teresa had suffered enough with him and persuaded his daughter to leave him. The stunned man quickly put his shoes on, grabbed the travelling bag left on the doorstep, and walked out quietly, carefully closing the door behind him. Oliver could not comprehend what he had just heard. He and his mother-in-law always had a good, warm relationship, and the fact that she considered him unworthy of Teresa shook the man to his core. Apparently, Teresa had already made up her mind. Oliver loved his wife with a selfless love, but if Teresa was unhappy and tormented with him, he would have to let his beloved woman go and cut her out of his life. Oliver stopped at his close friend. He spent a sleepless night recalling the words he had heard in his own home. The only dignified way out of this situation, the man considered, was the breakup of his relationship on his initiative. And so he did. Oliver wrote his wife a letter, in which he admitted that he had found another woman and would not return to her. He also said goodbye to her and wished her happiness. After sending the letter, he, with a broken and devastated heart, went away, having decided that there was nothing more for him to do in his native city. After his arrival in the capital, Oliver changed his phone number, deleted all the photos of his wife, to forget about the past and start life with a clean slate. He got a job as a bus driver and rented a small apartment. In order not to think about what had happened, the man immersed himself in his work. Meanwhile, Teresa, who was anxiously awaiting her husband's return from his shift, was shocked by the letter she received. Hoping she had misread it, the woman reread it over and over again, shedding bitter tears. When Miranda arrived at her daughter's house early in the morning, she found her sitting on the floor, sobbing desperately. The woman gasped, shuddered, and ran over to her crying daughter. "Teresa, what happened to you? Did you fall? Are you in pain?" she questioned, deciding that something had happened to the unborn child. Teresa silently held out Oliver's letter. "Why has he done this to me? He found someone for himself while he was working in another town, and he decided to forget about me. How am I supposed to go on living? And my baby? Why should the baby grow up without a father? We have dreamed of this pregnancy for so long. Now it has come, but there is no sense of life." "Don't say that," whispered Miranda affectionately. "Don't be angry with God. You'll be a mother soon. That's what you should think about, instead of suffering. Time will heal everything, my dear. Your pain will pass. We will raise the child with you. Don't worry. I will help you in everything." After her mother's words, Teresa calmed down a little and stopped sobbing. As Miranda said, time really healed the young woman's wounds. She did not stop loving her husband, but she hid her feelings for him deep in her heart. Teresa still believed that one day the door of her house would open and Oliver would appear on the threshold. But most of the time her thoughts were occupied with the baby she was carrying under her heart. Soon, pleasant worries filled Teresa's life, relieving her of mental torment. In due time, Teresa gave birth to a healthy son who was an exact copy of his father. She named him Foster. Foster grew up to be a nimble, quick-witted child, and the days flew by even faster with him. When he was 3 years old, Teresa decided to go with the boy to the capital and visit a close friend, Ruby. A few days after her arrival, Teresa wanted to show Foster the zoo. Since it was not far from the house where Ruby lived, the woman decided to take the bus. Surprisingly, the bus driver turned out to be Oliver. She looked at him in confusion until she finally came to her senses. "Oliver, is that you?" Oliver, forgetting about his work, stared at Teresa for a while and then finally whispered, "Hello, Teresa." He immediately turned his attention to the blonde boy, whom Teresa was holding by the hand, and thought with sorrow that she had already managed to give birth to a child by another man. The acute pain of his soul, which had not been felt for a long time, was again in Oliver's soul, and he became visibly gloomy. "Mummy, who is this, mister?" asked Foster, looking at his mother. "This mister is your daddy," replied Teresa, so that Oliver could hear, and then silently got her son off the bus. Oliver thought he had misheard her. He looked after the woman and her child, leaving in a confused manner, and realized that he could not let her go now, not having understood what had happened. He apologized to the passengers and jumped out of the bus and ran after his wife and son. He grabbed Teresa's arm abruptly and stopped her. "Tell me, is it true?" asked the man, practically out of breath. "Is he really my son?" Teresa nodded affirmatively and said in an excited, trembling voice, "I have never deceived you, and now I'm telling you the truth. But you have to go. The whole bus is waiting for you." Oliver looked at the bus and realized that now was not the best time and place to figure things out. "Yes, I have to go, but I'll be waiting for you at this spot tonight at 9 o'clock. Oliver took one last look at the child and Teresa and returned to the bus. At the zoo, the woman's thoughts were occupied only by her husband and his last words. She had no regrets about telling the truth and was surprised at Oliver's reaction. Did he really think she could have had a child that age from another man? Doubts and hesitations tormented her soul and mind, stubbornly telling her to leave the past and live in the present without her ex-husband. But her heart persistently asked to meet Oliver once more and at least talk to him. In the end, her heart overcame her mind, and leaving Foster with Ruby, Teresa went to meet Oliver. Her hands were shaking with excitement, and her heart was beating fast. Her whole body was trembling in her chest, and she was eager to look into the eyes of the man she still loved in spite of everything. Oliver was standing at the bus stop, wearing a thin jacket and holding an umbrella in his hand. The sky was gloomy and foggy. No sooner had Teresa come to the bus stop than it started to rain. Oliver ran up to Teresa with opened umbrella and hurriedly hid her from the rain. "Shall we go in?" the man suggested, pointing to a small cafe near the bus stop. Teresa nodded in agreement. 10 minutes later, they were sitting at a cozy table, drinking hot tea. The tense silence was broken by Oliver. "That boy, is he really my son?" "I have told you today that he is," interrupted him Teresa. "When you left me, I was pregnant. I was looking forward to your return to share this happiness with you, and you didn't even dare look into my eyes and say what you had written then. I have been home. I have heard everything." "What do you mean? And what have you heard? I don't understand anything," asked Teresa. "I came home early because I was going to surprise you. I even bought you your favorite flowers. Like a fool, I thought I was loved and waited for. I was sure of it until I heard your conversation. My dear mother-in-law was trying hard to persuade you to leave me and find a better match. And you yourself didn't mind and didn't argue with your mother when she was blaming me for tormenting you. I realized that when I came back, you would have put me in front of the fact that you didn't need me. So I turned around and left, and then I wrote a letter saying that I had found another woman, even though it wasn't true. In fact, I've always been faithful to you." Teresa froze, listening to her husband's story. She wanted to cry and laugh at the same time. At the time, she and her mother weren't discussing Oliver, but Teresa's boss, who kept the woman busy and made her work for two. Miranda urged her daughter to quit her thankless job and find a quieter place for herself. "How wrong you had been," the woman exclaimed. "I wasn't going to leave you. I was going to leave my job. You remember my boss, don't you? I used to complain about him to you. He had lost his conscience at all. He was making me do other people's jobs. He was always picking on me and belittling my virtues. Plus, he was paying me a penny. All this practically drove me to a nervous breakdown. Since my condition, my mother demanded that I quit my job. That was it.
I have always loved you now, and will continue to love you. But you decided everything for us, without giving us the slightest opportunity to explain ourselves. I would have told you about all this, but you left me." The woman was so hurt by that memory that after wiping away her tears, she got up and was about to leave. But Oliver stopped her by grabbing her hand hastily. He pulled her to him and kissed her. From that moment on, the couple never parted again. They were raising their son in love and harmony, and there were no more such fatal misunderstandings in their relationship. "Teresa, you don't understand anything. He doesn't love you. He just wants to use you," Patrick said. Teresa laughed. "Rubbish. I don't know why you don't like Geoffrey so much, but he's a really good guy. I may be wrong, of course, but Patrick, come on, admit it. You're saying this out of spite. I'm even offended, honestly. I thought we had resolved everything, talked about everything. Why are you starting again?" Patrick looked at Teresa. Of course, he had already talked and even decided that they would just be friends. How else could it be, if they had known each other since kindergarten? 5 years ago, Teresa had laughed at his confession of love and said, "Patrick, you're crazy. We're like brother and sister. At least, that's how I feel about you." Patrick took offence and went to work as a shift worker. He was gone for about a year, then returned just to tell Teresa that he was willing to be just a friend. And what else could he do? He just couldn't be without her. Teresa always shared everything with him. He knew she wasn't getting married until she achieved something in her career. Patrick even teased her, saying that when she became older, useless to anyone but wealthy, then he would agree to marry her. But recently, Teresa shocked him that she was getting married. Patrick had a hard time holding back. It was good that she told him over the phone, but after a moment's pause, he asked, "And who is this lucky guy? A local rich man? You wouldn't have agreed to anyone else." A year ago, Teresa had opened a small company that provides various services for businesses. The company, though small, brought in a steady income. Patrick knew that Teresa had plans to expand, and a strange thought even crossed his mind that she was getting married out of calculation to make it easier to develop her business. "No, Patrick, you've got it wrong. He's just an ordinary guy. Really nice," Teresa corrected him. "It's weird to call a grown man a guy. Let me guess, if you're 32, he's definitely over 40. Teresa laughed. "Not at all. He's 25. "What? Are you kidding?" Patrick thought he must have misheard. He always thought of Teresa as a smart, mature woman. Teresa seemed offended. "Why would I joke? Or do you think only pensioners can look at me now?" "You got me wrong. All right, it's your business. Will you introduce me to your fiancé?" "Of course. That's why I'm calling today. Today we have something like a wedding announcement. I'll be happy to see you among the guests." Patrick didn't like Geoffrey. In fact, none of Teresa's chosen ones would appeal to him. But Geoffrey, there was something about him. Patrick couldn't explain what exactly. He watched the man all night long and drew a few conclusions for himself. Firstly, Geoffrey hugged Teresa too frequently in front of everyone, as if he wanted everyone to believe in his sincerity. Secondly, he avoided looking people in the eyes. If you addressed Geoffrey, he would respond, but he would look anywhere but into your eyes. And thirdly, he waned to hang out too much. Everyone was tired of the party, and he still wanted music and champagne. Such people usually don't have any other interests besides having fun. But Patrick didn't say anything to Teresa at the party. He didn't want to spoil her mood. And today he only spoke up after Teresa said that she was taking care of all the wedding expenses because Geoffrey was having temporary financial difficulties. They argued so much that Teresa told Patrick not to come to her wedding and not to ruin her mood. Of course, she regretted her words, but when she decided to call him 3 days later, the subscriber was unavailable. "Well, you've gone back to your backwards again. You should have gotten married. Maybe you wouldn't have time to be bitter then," said Teresa angrily and threw the phone away from her. She tried to calm down, reminding herself that the wedding was coming up soon and she would have someone she loved by her side. And who loved her so much? Teresa had been with men before, but she had never experienced such strong emotions and feelings. However, happiness didn't last long. At first, Geoffrey was perfect. With him, Teresa couldn't be happier. But then, Geoffrey felt uncomfortable coming to her company because she was the owner and he was nobody. To solve this, Teresa made him her deputy. She began to trust him with deals and spent more time on herself. To give herself more opportunities, she wrote a power of attorney so that he wouldn't bother her every time. Geoffrey was grateful and almost worshipped her. When people started telling Teresa that Geoffrey was cheating on her, she simply brushed it off. In her opinion, something like this couldn't be true. One evening they were returning from a restaurant and Geoffrey was driving. A tragedy occurred when he didn't see a person in the dark. The bump was strong. Teresa hit her head and the panel cut her forehead, causing her to lose consciousness. When she woke up, someone was telling her, "Wake up already, you smell of alcohol." It took a moment for Teresa to realize that this was about her. She tried to explain that she had only had a little wine at the restaurant, and then she opened her eyes and saw that she was behind the wheel, and a black-covered body was lying in front of the car. She turned around and saw her husband talking to the policeman. "You know, my wife always gets behind the wheel when she drinks. No scandals help, and this is where it led to," he said to the policeman, who nodded in agreement and wrote something down. Geoffrey looked at her and then smiled, but Teresa squeezed her eyes shut. This couldn't be happening. Her husband never visited her once. During the court proceedings, he spoke so terribly about her that the kind words of others were drowned out. As the condemned Teresa was being led out, she turned to look at her husband. At first, he smiled, but the longer Teresa looked at him, the less happy his face became. Something in the wife's gaze made Geoffrey tremble slightly inside. A year passed. "Teresa Harmon, pack your belongings for departure." Teresa got up and gathered her things. She didn't believe until the end that they would release her. As the gate slammed shut behind her, she closed her eyes and cried. Lord, was she really free? Teresa learned from rare letters from former friends that Geoffrey had sold everything she had during the year. Well, it was her own fault, because she had signed the power of attorney with her own hands. He stayed in the city for some time, and then went to the sea with a young mistress. All this time, while her sky was divided into cells, Teresa believed that someday she would be free and would devote all her time to searching for Geoffrey. Even if it took her the rest of her life, she would definitely find him. Teresa didn't even know
what she would do when she found him, but finding him was vital. She would decide then. "Teresa?" The woman opened her eyes abruptly and stumbled. Patrick was standing near the prison gates. Her Patrick. He was the same, only his temples were completely grey. It was strange. How did he manage to turn grey like that? She ran to him, and he picked her up and hugged her. "Patrick, I thought I'd never see you again." The man carefully put her down. "Don't even hope. I'll always be around." Teresa reached out and stroked his grey hair with her fingers. He chuckled shyly. "I turned grey while you were gone." Teresa burst into tears, and Patrick had to give her water. He took her to the nearest town, where he had rented a hotel room. "I arrived just 2 hours ago. Anyway, please make yourself at home. There's a bathroom. I'll go to the store. We should celebrate this occasion." Teresa lost track of time while soaking in the hot, fragrant foam. It felt like only 5 minutes had passed when Patrick cautiously stuck his head into the bathroom. "You haven't fallen asleep in there, have you? Look, I bought something. Hopefully it will fit. And please hurry up a little. I'm already setting the table." Teresa opened the package. The lingerie was beautiful and soft. There was a snow-white robe and something else, but that was for later. Currently, she was content with what she had found on top. Jeffrey paced back and forth. He didn't like how Andrea was behaving. He had been there for her all this year, but as soon as he mentioned the need to start living more frugally because they were running out of money, she rolled her eyes and started being rude to him. Recently, he decided to talk to her. "Andrea, don't you think you're not acting very nicely? I'm waiting for you at home and you're out somewhere." She lazily looked at him. "I was at a restaurant." "But we could go somewhere else together." "Where? To the park?" "You don't have enough money for a decent restaurant." Jeffrey flared up. "So you're with me just for the money?" "No, I'm with you for great love," Andrea laughed. "Just like you were with your wife. You know, Jeffrey, you should find out if she's available. Maybe she can help you start another company. You can't do it yourself because you don't have enough brain." Honestly, Jeffrey wanted to hit her, but he knew he wouldn't see her again if he did. "Andrea." "Jeffrey, stop whining. A man shouldn't whine," she said, and left the room while Jeffrey looked at the door and clenched his fists. After a week, Andrea left without saying a word. She just packed her things and left silently. He tried to stop her and even shed a tear, but the girl didn't even look at him. Another week later, he was asked to move out of the apartment. It was a rental and Jeffrey hadn't paid for it for 2 months. He had no choice but to find a job. However, when he found out how much they paid in this town, he couldn't help but laugh. Taking out his last bit of savings, Jeffrey decided to return to his hometown, where he at least had a small apartment of his own. The city greeted him unfriendly. Jeffrey pulled up his hood and headed towards his house. The apartment smelled of dust, mold, and a thick pile of bills that needed to be paid. He gathered the papers and angrily threw them on the table. Then he walked around the rooms. How miserable it was here. Yes, lately he had gotten used to luxury. Here it didn't smell like it. The entrance door creaked, probably swayed by the wind. He headed to the hallway, but unfamiliar people were already entering the room. Jeffrey stepped back, and when he saw who came in the end, he even stumbled. Teresa? She was even more beautiful, slightly thinner than before, but that's understandable. She wasn't on vacation. "Didn't you recognize me, hubby? I came back and wanted to get those keys to my house and my company," Teresa said. Jeffrey understood that all these people came with her for a reason. "Teresa, they made me.
I swear to you, I loved you very much, but they threatened me with such things that I couldn't resist." Teresa smiled affectionately. Geoffrey shuddered at the sight of her smile. There was some familiar guy standing behind her. Exactly, she had introduced them once. This was some childhood friend of hers. "And who are they?" Teresa asked. "What do you mean?" "Your envious competitors, of course." "And what did they threaten you with?" Teresa asked. Geoffrey didn't have time to come up with an answer, because two men in uniform entered the room, bringing with them an elderly stranger. "Look closely at him, please," one of the men said. "I remember him well," said the elderly man. "I was walking by and saw him dragging on an unconscious woman. I said to him, 'What are you doing, shameless one?' He told me to walk quickly and not say anything, or he'll find me and kill me." "Where did he drag her?" asked one of the policemen. The elderly man pointed at Teresa. "There she is, by the way. He put her behind the wheel. Yeah, no matter how long the rope, there's always an end." Geoffrey howled and rushed towards the door, managing to break through. However, people were waiting for him outside the door. They twisted him so roughly that he cried out in pain. It all repeated like a dream, only this time Teresa was sitting on a bench for witnesses, and Geoffrey was where he was supposed to be a long time ago. They accused him of many things: the death of the man who died under the wheels of his car, fraud, conspiracy, and resisting the police. Geoffrey understood that, as a young and healthy person, he would not see this world again. When the guards were taking him away, Teresa met his gaze. She was smiling now, but Geoffrey's gaze was extinguished, and he quickly turned away. Patrick hugged Teresa by her shoulders. "Well, that's it. And now we're going to the registry office to get married." Teresa turned around, kissed him on the nose, and said, "Of course we are." Patrick exhaled loudly and pulled her by the hand towards the exit.